Hello fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. I'm here today to tell you all about what it actually means now that we've moved over to the SiriusXM family. Big picture, it means we are going to make more content for you. Right now, you get one YouTube video a week on Saturday. Well, what we're going to do now is we're going to have the Saturday upload be the same, but then also the MrBallen podcast. Well, we've begun already filming those episodes like a YouTube video. So that's a second piece of content every week. Then there's 2 other shows that you guys don't even know about yet, which means on any given week, you could have up to 4 new video pieces of content on the MrBallen channel. And also, all these pieces of content will double as podcasts as well. This new content schedule is going to start early next year. Also, there's one other thing I want to clarify, which is the state of MrBallen's Medical Mysteries and Redacted. Those shows were created in collaboration with Wondery, but now we're partnered with Sirius, and so we're not going to be making any new episodes of either of those shows. For now, if you want to hear my podcast episodes 1 week early and ad-free, make sure to subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. Keep on the lookout for more announcements in the coming weeks. Thank you. In today's story, a family uncovers a secret on a laptop, and after that, everything spirals completely out of control. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right show because that's all we do. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the follow button lets you look through their prized 1970s family photo album, make sure you aggressively lick your finger and flip the pages each time so you smudge all the edges. On the night of January 3rd, 2008, a 21-year-old man named Part Engel had just poured himself a beer and sat down on the couch next to his girlfriend to watch some TV when he heard a knock at the front door of his apartment in Pottstown, Pennsylvania. It was late, around 8 p.m., and Part was not expecting any company, and so before he got up, he looked over at his girlfriend to be like, "Are you expecting anybody?" And she looked at him and kind of shrugged, and so Part just put his beer down and stood up and walked over to the front door to see who was there. And when Part opened up the front door, he was very surprised to see his mother standing there carrying a small duffel bag. So Part's mother lived in Middletown Township, which was located about an hour and a half away from Part's apartment. And while it was not unusual for Part's mom to stay over at Part's apartment, what was unusual is her just showing up unannounced. She never did that. And on top of that, as Part is looking at his mom, he could see clearly she had been crying, because her eyeliner was smudged and her face was all puffy, and so Part knew clearly, there must be a problem here. But when he asked his mother, "What's going on, Mom?" she wouldn't tell him. She would just say, "I have to stay with you for the night." And then before he or Part's girlfriend could do or say anything, his mom just walked inside, walked down the hallway, went into the guest bedroom, and then shut and locked the door. And so Part and his girlfriend were left looking at each other like, what's going on here? 3 hours later, at 11 p.m., Part was in bed next to his sleeping girlfriend, just staring up at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Part was so anxious about whatever was going on with his mom, because where he was staying, his bedroom, was right next door to the guest bedroom where his mom was staying, and so he already knows there's clearly some issue here with his mom, but all night he's been listening to her next door, just pacing and crying in this guest bedroom, and he has no idea what's going on. But deep down, Part knew that whatever was going on, it very likely had to do with his father, whose name was Arun Kumar. Part's parents had a complicated relationship. They had immigrated from India decades earlier and had settled in Pennsylvania, where they had 2 kids, Part and Part's sister. Part's father, Arun Kumar, worked as an engineer at Boeing, and Part's mother owned a 7-Eleven franchise. And basically, since arriving in America, the 2 of them had really come with nothing and had worked their way up to now to where they had a very comfortable life, kind of like the American dream, the house, the white picket fence, the kids, the whole thing. And so Part had always believed that, his parents, as a result of getting through so much hardship together, that they must truly love each other now. I mean, to have gone through all that together, that would certainly make 2 people very close. And for the most part, that actually seemed to have been the case, that his parents just got along great and were a great couple. That is until a couple of years earlier. Arun Kumar had started an affair, and Part's mother had caught him. Now, Arun Kumar said that, this affair meant nothing and he would stop right now, and Part's mother had forgiven him, in order to keep the family together. But despite Part's mom forgiving Arun Kumar, deep down, she just knew she could never actually trust him again. And so she actually wound up enlisting Part's help to basically watch Arun Kumar's behavior. She had Arun Kumar set up the software that basically spied on Arun Kumar's computer. Through this software, Part's mom could basically watch Arun Kumar's email traffic and all of his internet activity. Now, Part had not felt good about setting up the spy software on his dad's computer. It just felt totally wrong to be getting in between his parents like this. But he just felt like this was the only way Part's mom was ever going to be able to actually move on, and so Part sort of felt like this was his responsibility. This is the way that the family was going to stay together. His mom really just needed that extra layer of transparency on her husband, otherwise the family was going to fall apart. But now, as Part lay in his bed, unable to sleep, listening to his mom pace back and forth in the room next door, he began to think to himself, maybe my mom found something using the software on my dad's computer. Maybe Arun Kumar had started another affair, and that was why his mom was now so upset. But just then, Part heard a new noise coming out of his mother's room. At first, it kind of sounded like low murmuring, like his mom was saying something to herself, but then he realized his mom was having a real conversation with somebody on the phone. And since Part couldn't sleep, and he was pretty intrigued about what the heck was going on with his mom to begin with, he decided to basically spy on his mom. So he very quietly got out of his bed, and he walked around to the wall that lined up against his mother's room, and he put his ear to the wall, and he began to listen. And what he heard was far worse than anything he could have imagined. What he heard his mom saying to whoever she was talking on the phone was that she had discovered that Arun Kumar had taken out $3.6 million in life insurance policies on Part, on his sister, and on his mother. And now Part's mom was saying to whoever she was talking to on the phone that she wasn't even worried about divorce at this point. She was worried about the physical safety of her and her kids. She was worried that her husband was going to kill her and her kids to get this payout. And so not long after saying this, Part's mom hung up the phone and went back to pacing and crying in the room. And Part, meanwhile, has just heard this horrifying news, and he had no idea what to make of it. I mean, he knew his dad was not a good husband. But the idea that his dad would want to hurt his wife, or him, or his sister, just seemed totally impossible. But then, as Part's standing there just kind of processing what he's heard, he began to think back to these recent behavioral changes he noticed in his father that at the time he had kind of chalked up to, maybe my dad's stressed or something. But now, given the context of what his mom was talking about, Part began to wonder if these behavioral changes were a sign of something being terribly wrong with his father. The first change that Part had noticed happened a few weeks earlier. Now, Part's dad was normally a very mild-mannered and calm guy, but a few weeks earlier, he had gotten into this vicious dispute with their next-door neighbor over the property line that ran between their two properties. It was like he was picking a fight with the neighbor or something. And then, a few days after that, one of the bathroom sinks in their house had stopped working, and so Arun Kumar got out his tools and went to go break apart the sink and put it back together again, and because he was an engineer, this was something he did, this was typical behavior. But after breaking apart the sink, basically ripping it all apart and having all the parts on the ground, Part's dad didn't put it back together. He just left all the tools and all the parts just scattered across the bathroom floor. And considering that Arun Kumar was typically incredibly meticulous and organized, and he's this brilliant engineer, to Part, seeing his dad leave this sloppy mess and this unfinished sink, it felt totally off. And so standing there in his bedroom, totally horrified about everything he's heard, and now kind of second-guessing everything he knew about his dad, who suddenly seemed like this combative, kind of disorganized guy, Part suddenly felt like, I have to learn more here. I have to figure out if my dad really is a threat. So Part quietly left his bedroom and made his way to the kitchen where his laptop was, and he loaded up that software that spied on his dad's computer. And as he began logging into this program, Part was thinking, maybe I'm going to find something that will show that my mom is clearly just overreacting and misinterpreting what she's seeing, that, my dad is not, out to kill us for some insurance payout. But after loading up this program and kind of scanning through some recent activity, Part realized that actually the situation with his dad was way worse than his mom had made out on that call he overheard. He not only found all these multi-million-dollar insurance policies taken out on him, his sister, and his mom, but also he discovered this stash of fraudulent-looking paperwork. There were all these passport photos of his father, but then connected to these photos was a passport application that was using somebody else's name, as if his father was trying to forge paperwork to create a phony passport for himself. And so at this point, Part felt like his mother was certainly not overreacting here, that in fact it really did seem like his father was, preparing to kill his family and collect millions of dollars in insurance money, and then using this, fake passport he was making, he'd be able to flee the country. For the next several days, Part's mom stayed at Part's apartment, but she barely ever left the guest bedroom. And then when she would leave the bedroom, Part would go up to her and try to ask her, hey, what's going on, without giving away how much he knew already. But Part's mom was like, nope, I don't want to talk about it, and she would just go right back in the room, shut and lock the door. And so finally, after several days of this, Part just went to his mom's bedroom door, he knocked on the door until she answered, and then before she could kind of shoo him away, he said, Mom, stop, I know what's going on, I read the emails, and we have to figure out what we're going to do, because our lives literally depend on it. I agree with you, it looks like Dad is going to kill us and then flee the country. And so Part and his mom would talk through all the details of what was found on his computer, and ultimately they would decide that Part would be the one to go to police and tell them what was going on with Arun Kumar. And so the next day, Part went to the police station, with a stack of evidence that he believed would implicate his father, and Part was so nervous about this, he was shaking. But when he talked to an actual police officer, they looked over his evidence and they heard the whole story, but they told him, look, we really can't do anything about this. They told Part that, it's not illegal to take out life insurance policies on your family, and then also the police officer pointed out that in addition to Arun Kumar taking out those policies on his kids and his wife, he had also taken out a policy on himself and made his wife and his kids the beneficiaries of that policy. And so the police officer said, look, this does not look like a murder plot to me, it just looks like your dad is doing something fairly responsible. And then as for the passport application paperwork, where his dad had used a phony name, the police officer said, look, he has not filed this paperwork, and so it's not illegal what he's doing. Anybody can get some paperwork out and fill it in with whatever they want. It becomes illegal if they attempt to actually pass it off and submit the paperwork, and as far as we know, he hasn't done that. So that's weird, but it's not illegal. And so Part had to leave the police station, and he went back to the apartment and he told his mom what happened, and ultimately they decided that all they could do now was just wait and continue to watch that software that monitored Arun Kumar's computer and just hope Arun Kumar would do something that was incriminating that they could then bring to the police and say, see, he's trying to kill us and collect a payout and flee the country. But over the next few days that Part and his mother every day just constantly checked this software and watched what Arun Kumar was doing on his computer, all they saw was Arun Kumar was using his computer to do work emails and really basic stuff, absolutely nothing incriminating. And in fact, over these few days, Arun Kumar would actually call Part's mom to ask her when she was coming back home again, and she would tell him that basically she was going to stay at Part's place indefinitely, and Arun Kumar did not seem upset or annoyed by this at all. If anything, it just seemed like he was really distracted and wasn't actually listening to Part's mom as she was speaking. And while this did seem kind of suspicious to Part and his mom, that basically Arun Kumar didn't care that his wife wasn't coming home anytime soon, it still wasn't incriminating. And so Part and his mom decided to just continue looking deeper and deeper into Arun Kumar's computer to see if there was anything that could begin to explain what was really going on here. And sure enough, Part dug deeper and deeper into Arun Kumar's computer, and he did discover something. Part began finding all these emails with people back in India that kind of vaguely indicated that Arun Kumar was involved in a very sketchy deal, like a business deal. Now, again, the emails were incredibly vague, but what was clear in these back and forths in these emails was that it seemed like Arun Kumar had gotten wrapped up with some really shady people, and they were having these really nasty exchanges in these emails about this, deal that Arun Kumar seemed to be involved in. And so Part began to wonder if maybe he and his mom had this all backwards, that he, his mom, and his sister were not the ones actually in danger here, that in fact, it was Arun Kumar who was in danger. Maybe because this deal, went south, and these people that he was doing this deal with, maybe they were mad at him. And so perhaps all these life insurance policies and this new fake identity were some sort of move by Arun Kumar to kind of flee the danger he was in. And so obviously, if this was true, this was still a horrible situation for their whole family, but it was markedly better than what Part and his mom had been operating on before, which was, that Arun Kumar was going to kill his whole family. And so pretty quickly, as a result of kind of thinking about this in a new way, Part's mother started feeling a lot better about the whole situation and actually left Part's apartment and went back to the house to go live with Arun Kumar. And Part himself began to think that, maybe this is not as big of a deal as we thought it was. I'm sure my dad will figure out whatever he needs to figure out here to get out of whatever mess he's in. And over the coming days, Part checked in with his mom every single day because now she's living with Arun Kumar and she said everything was fine. And Part, he continued to check his dad's computer activity and nothing else really popped up. It was still just the same stuff they had originally found. And so it just kind of seemed like, maybe this really is not as big of a deal as we thought it was. But on the morning of January 20th, 2008, so about 2.5 weeks after Part's mom showed up at his apartment, everything changed. On that morning, Part logged into his computer to check on his dad's computer using that software because he was still checking it every single day. And the first thing he saw was his dad had sent this email to this woman who Part didn't know, and this woman was certainly not his mother. And in this email, his dad told this person that he had a big contract coming up and he was going to make a ton of money from it. And then also at the end of this email, he told this woman that he loved her. And so right away, Part's thinking, okay, my dad is obviously having another affair because this is not my mom and he's saying he loves her. And also, what's my dad talking about with this big contract coming up? Is he talking about the insurance policies? Does he expect those to pay out soon, indicating that I, my sister, or my mom might be dead? And then also, the other thing that Part noticed that morning as he's checking through his dad's computer activity is he found another message his dad had sent out recently where he communicated to somebody that his father had died. So Part's grandfather had died. And also in this message, Arun Kumar is telling this person that he's going to go to his dad's funeral alone, that his wife and 2 kids were not invited to this funeral. And so Part's reading this, and he's totally devastated by the fact that his grandfather's dead, and the fact that, he's not being invited to the funeral? But again, he's thinking, oh my gosh, is that because my dad thinks I'm not going to be alive? Is this all connected, between the big contract and the fact that we're not going to be at the funeral? Is this my dad thinking he's going to enact this murder plot soon? Part didn't know, but he felt like he and his mom and his sister were running out of time, and he needed to act right now. And so Part got off his computer, he called his mom, and they made a plan. That evening, at around 9:15 p.m., Part got in his car and began driving towards his parents' house to go confront his dad. This was the plan he and his mom had come up with. Basically, his mom would stay at Part's apartment, and Part would go and tell his dad, we know about what you're doing, and you gotta stop. And even though Part was totally jacked up on adrenaline as he drove towards the house, he felt like he really had the upper hand going into whatever this confrontation was going to be. Because, number one, Part was showing up totally unannounced at night to his dad's place. His dad's going to be caught off guard when he sees him. And also, Part knew he was much physically bigger than his father. Part was over 6 feet tall and over 200 pounds, and so he had the physical angle as well. And so Part really felt confident driving towards the house that he was going to come out the victor in whatever ensued. At around 10:45 p.m., Part finally arrived in front of his parents' house. He parked the car, he got out, he walked up the front steps, and he knocked on the front door. And a couple of seconds later, Arun Kumar came to the door, he opened it up, and he's totally confused to see his son standing there. And then before Arun Kumar could do anything, Part, in his deepest and most authoritative voice, looked at his dad and said, "We need to talk." And then he intentionally bumped into his dad with his shoulder as he walked into the house. And so his dad is standing at the front door, not really sure what's going on. And Part, after taking a few steps in, he abruptly turns around, and so now he's looking back at his dad. And he takes a step forward and gets right in his dad's face and says, I know what you're up to, I know what you've done, and you have a simple choice to make. You can either stop what you're doing and become the family man you're supposed to be, faithful to mom, or I'm going to go to the police and tell them what you're up to, and you're going to go to jail. Either way, whatever you're doing stops right now. And for a moment, Part and Arun Kumar are basically staring at each other in silence, and then Arun Kumar, before Part could stop him, basically ran past Part, passed him down the hallway, and he ran into the master bedroom, disappearing from Part's view. And so Part's turned around, and he wasn't expecting this, and suddenly all that confidence he had going into this confrontation was gone. because he's thinking, oh my goodness, my dad, maybe he's got a weapon in there. I need to get in there and stop him. And so he turns and runs down the hallway. He darts into the bedroom, having no idea what he's going to see inside, but what he sees does catch him off guard. Arun Kumar is just sitting on the bed, doing nothing. He's just staring what looks like at the wall, and Part just stops in the doorway, looks at his dad, and then realizes his dad's not just absently staring at the wall, he's staring into the open bathroom. And in the open bathroom, on the ground, are all those tools left over from where his dad had been working on the sink and then never finished. Like, all these tools are scattered on the ground, including one tool that now Part is realizing his dad is looking directly at. It was a big, heavy metal pipe wrench. And suddenly Part realized, my dad is looking at a weapon, and he's considering whether or not to get that weapon and attack me with it. The next morning, Part's mother pulled up in front of the house that she shared with Arun Kumar. She walked up the steps, went to the front door, she opened it up, and as soon as she stepped inside, she yelled out, hello, who's here? But there was silence. And immediately she got a bad feeling, but she knew she had to investigate. And so Part's mom began slowly walking down the hallway, the same hallway that Part and his dad had been fighting in the night before. And she went down the hallway and she turned and looked into the master bedroom, and she couldn't believe what she saw. There was blood on the carpets, on the walls. It was a bloodbath, and in the middle of the room was an obvious dead body that was so mutilated and destroyed, she couldn't even identify it. And so seconds later, she had run outside and dialed 911. It would take police almost 4 years to finally untangle Arun Kumar's insane web of lies and also make an arrest for the murder that took place inside of that house. And the reason it took nearly 4 years is because nothing in this case was what it looked like. Now, Part and his mother had been correct about a number of things about Arun Kumar. For example, Arun Kumar was having another affair, he had taken out life insurance policies on his whole family, and he was looking to obtain a fake identity. They were also right that Arun Kumar had become embroiled in a very shady deal back in India, but the specifics of that deal were not what Part and Part's mom thought it was. And when Arun Kumar announced in that message that, his father had died and he'd be traveling to India all alone, that his wife and his kids weren't coming, they weren't invited, well, Part and his mom had been correct. That this was a cover, this was an excuse for Arun Kumar to put his big plan into action. And Arun Kumar's big plan did involve murder, and so Part and his mom were right about that aspect of his plan. However, Arun Kumar's target for this murder was not who Part and his mom thought it was. They were not the target. Arun Kumar was going to murder himself. Or more specifically, he was going to pretend to kill himself. That was actually the shady deal he was involved in back in India. He was working with people who could help him fake his own death. And so what he was going to do is go to India, fake his death, and then once he was dead on paper, that would trigger an insurance payout of his own life insurance policy, and that money would go to his wife and his kids, and then Arun Kumar would disappear using his fake identity he would have, along with his mistress, the woman he was having an affair with. That was the person he had sent that email to talking about the big payout. But Part and Part's mom did not know this last critical piece of Arun Kumar's plan. They really believed they were the target of this big plot, that they were going to get killed. And so that's why they felt like they had to act first. So on January 20th, 2008, Part and his mother worked out an alibi for themselves. What they were going to tell people is that at around 8 p.m., Part went and picked up his mother from the house that she shared with Arun Kumar, and the two of them just went back to Part's apartment, and that was it. But in reality, Part never went over and picked his mom up and brought her back to the apartment. Instead, she was at the house with Arun Kumar when Part showed up at 10:45 p.m. to confront Arun Kumar. So it was him and his mom at the house as Part is demanding Arun Kumar come clean and stop what he's doing. And then at some point during this heated argument in the hallway, Arun Kumar turned and ran into the bedroom, and Part chased after him. And Part, he sees Arun Kumar sitting on the edge of the bed, and he thinks his dad is looking at the pipe wrench on the floor in the bathroom. And Part thinks, my dad is about to get that wrench and attack me with it. And so Part just acted first, and he ran and grabbed that wrench, and he beat his father to death with it. and then after leaving his father's unrecognizable mutilated body just lumped in the middle of the bedroom floor, blood all over the walls, he and his mother just left the house and went back to Part's apartment, and then the next day, Part's mom went back to the house and she pretended to find Arun Kumar's body, even though she already knew he was in there, and then she called 911 and acted totally beside herself when they showed up, as if she had just happened upon her husband's dead body. But almost 4 years later, when the truth finally came out about this horrible situation, Part and his mother were arrested. Now, both of them absolutely maintained that they genuinely believed their lives were in danger because of Arun Kumar, and they said during that confrontation in the house, Part was only acting in self-defense. He really believed his dad was going to grab that pipe wrench first, and so he had to. Today's podcast features two separate, unique stories that are both themed around the same thing: family secrets. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from my YouTube channel and has been remastered for this episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Most Terrifying Family You've Never Heard Of, and it's about an obscure cult who admitted to performing a heinous ritual in the 1970s. The second story you'll hear is called Someone in This Family Has a Secret, and it's about a family in Ohio who started noticing some very strange people lurking around the outside of their house at night. Both of these stories contain graphic content, but it is the first story about the cult ritual that needs a special warning. It contains extreme graphic violence and sexual content. As such, listener discretion is advised. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to curl the 5-star review button's hair for their wedding, but then repeatedly touch the top of their ear with the curling iron. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story. In the early 1950s, Harold Alexander, who was a young stonemason living in Hamburg, Germany, came in contact with an old man named George Reel. George was the leader of a small religious group called the Lorber Society. This group, which never had a large membership at any point in their short history, was rooted in the Christian faith, but their views were far more extreme than the average Christian congregation. For example, many Christians believe in the concept of self-denial, which in layman's terms means to deny oneself some personal human pleasures, like certain sexual practices or the overindulgence of food or drinking, and all of this is done to gain favor with God. But George and the other members of the Lorber Society took this concept of self-denial to the extreme. They practiced it so aggressively and so literally that nobody in the society could really have a life of their own. All they could do to adhere to their society's very strict rules was to worship God 24/7. In addition to their very severe lifestyles, members of the Lorber Society also believed that anybody outside of their small society was basically evil. So Harold meets George. It's unclear exactly how he meets George, but he does, and immediately Harold is blown away by George. He thinks he's totally incredible, he's so charismatic, and apparently George felt equally highly about Harold. And so right away they have this friendship they strike up, and Harold and his wife Dragma, they end up joining the Lorber Society, and they completely give themselves over to this very intense lifestyle, and they listen to everything George tells them to do. And then very quickly after Harold and his wife had joined this society, their leader, George, became very ill, and it became clear he was going to die soon. When George was on his deathbed, Harold went to visit him, and after speaking with him privately in this room, Harold emerges and he tells his wife that George has told him that he is going to be the next leader of the Lorber Society once George passes away. And so his wife accepts this, as does the rest of the society members, and then after George actually does die, everyone in the society just turns towards Harold and begins listening to him and following him. It's worth noting that we don't know for sure if George really did tell Harold that he was going to be the next leader of the Lorber Society, or if Harold just made that up because he knew George was going to die soon and he could kind of get away with stealing that title. Over the next few years that Harold was in charge of the Lorber Society, he began introducing a new concept to the members.
he would continuously tell them that they needed to be ready for when the next prophet of God returned to the earth. Harold told his members that when this happened, 1, Harold would know immediately and he would tell them, and 2, whatever this prophet wanted, no matter how confusing or crazy or terrible, they had to do it without question because this was God's will. In 1953, so roughly a year or two after Harold has taken over the Lorber Society, he and his wife, Drogma, have their second child. It's their first boy, and they name him Frank. And as soon as this child is born, Harold looks at him and determines that this boy, his son, is the prophet they have all been waiting for. And so he tells his wife and he tells the members of the Lorber Society that his son, Frank, is the prophet of God, and everyone across the board completely accepts it. As the prophet, Frank, grew up, he was shamelessly worshipped and waited on 24/7 by the members of the Lorber Society and his own family. And so naturally, this had a profound impact on the way Frank thought and how he behaved. By the time Frank was at the age of grade school children, he fully believed that he was the prophet of God, and he began using that authority to kind of boss his family around more than he really needed to, especially his 3 sisters and his mother. But no one ever intervened because, again, this is the prophet of God and he can do whatever he wants. When Frank turned 16, he started thinking about girls and sex, but he was conflicted because he had been taught everybody outside of this society he was a part of were evil. And so he didn't want to pollute himself by having sex with these evil women. And so he went to his father and told him that he wants to start having sex with his mother and his sisters in order to stay pure. And his father, Harold, not only embraced the idea, he encouraged it. And in fact, he would often join in with his son during the sexual intercourse. As for the 4 Alexander women, they completely accepted their new roles as sexual objects because they believed by doing whatever Frank the prophet wanted, they were serving God. Eventually, one of these sisters began talking to some of her very few friends at school about how she was kind of jealous of her other sisters for all the attention they were getting from Frank. And so the friends kind of picked up on this strange relationship between the siblings, and before long, rumors had started about there being some incestuous relations inside of this family, and those rumors eventually made their way to the parents of students, and then from the parents, that made its way to the police, and before long, Harold had discovered that the Hamburg police were about to launch an investigation into his family. And at the same time, Harold also discovered that members of the Lorber Society, they had heard about these incest rumors as well, and they had their own suspicions already, and they were not on board with incest. And so they were very clearly starting to distance themselves from Harold and his family. And so it was pretty clear to Harold that the writing was on the wall. He and his family were no longer welcome in Hamburg. And so he goes to the Lorber Society and kind of retires and says, I'm leaving. You need to find yourself a new leader of this society. And then he and his family completely broke ties with the Lorber Society. They left Hamburg and fled south to Santa Cruz, which is a city on the Canary Islands in Spain. And so they settle into this little apartment inside of this busy city, and very quickly they fell back into their old routines of constantly worshiping Frank, the prophet of God, despite the fact that they were no longer affiliated with the Lorber Society, and so their actions were now being driven by their own personal belief system. 10 months later, on December 22nd, 1970, a wealthy doctor named Walter Trankler was at his villa, which was located not far from where the Alexanders lived, when he heard a knock at his front door. When he opened the front door, he saw there were these 2 men who he didn't recognize, who were covered head to toe in what looked like mud. And at first, he was totally taken aback by their appearance and almost wanted to just shut the door. But in order to be polite, he kept the door slightly open and said, hey, how can I help you guys? And the 2 men would introduce themselves as Harold and Frank Alexander, and they were there to speak with one of their family members, Sabine. Sabine was one of Frank's 2 younger sisters, and she worked for the doctor as a housemaid. And so the doctor, he didn't know any of Sabine's family members, so he just kind of took their request at face value and said, hold on, let me go get her. And so he leaves the front door, he goes into the kitchen, and he finds Sabine, this 15-year-old girl, and he tells her that your father and your brother are waiting for you outside. They want to talk to you. And so Sabine, without saying a word, puts her knife and the food down. She walks out of the kitchen with the doctor, and as they're walking towards the front door, the doctor stops about 10 or 15 feet away from the front door to kind of allow Sabine to walk up and have a semi-private conversation with her relatives, although they're still inside of his house, so he didn't want to go too far. And so the doctor is standing maybe 15 feet away, wondering if he should just turn around or maybe just go into the other room to let them speak, when he overhears the father, Harold, say something truly horrific to his daughter. It was so shocking that the doctor stopped what he was doing, turned, and looked directly at Sabine to see how she was going to react to what she just heard. But to the doctor's absolute shock, Sabine didn't break down and start crying or start screaming out in pain or anguish. Instead, she reached out and grabbed her father's muddy hand and pressed it to her cheek and said, "I'm sure you did what was necessary." And then the two embraced. The doctor stood there totally shocked, staring at these people, wondering what the heck they're doing. Why are they here? What are they talking about? Is this really happening? And then he just kind of blurts out, "Hey, I'll be right back. Stay right there." And then the doctor turned around and darted out of the front hall into another room where he barricaded himself inside, and then he called the police. When the police showed up just a few minutes later, they rolled into the front lot and they saw Harold, Frank, and Sabine were still just casually standing in the front doorway of the doctor's villa, seemingly not really trying to go anywhere or do anything. And so the police get out of their car, they walk up to the trio and they say, "What's going on? What are you doing here?" And Harold very calmly and casually tells one of the officers the same horrible thing that the doctor overheard him saying to Sabine. Except this time, Harold specified to the officers where this horrible thing took place. He said it happened inside of their apartment. The police were shocked at Harold's candidness and the fact that his two kids were standing right next to him and they're hearing what their father is saying. They too are just totally detached and very calm, as if nothing their father is saying is having any effect on them. It's just totally business as usual. And so the police asked Harold to repeat the story a few times to make sure they were hearing him correctly, and then they just arrested Harold and his two kids. After the three Alexanders were brought to the police station, 3 other police officers were sent over to the Alexanders' apartment in Santa Cruz to see if what Harold had said was actually true. And when these officers opened the front door to that apartment, they immediately could tell it was all true. The following is the story of what happened inside of that apartment based on the testimony given by Frank and Harold. On December 21st, 1970, so that's one day before Frank and Harold arrived on the doorstep of the doctor's villa, the father and son were home in their apartment with the mother, Dragma, as well as 2 of the 3 sisters. It was 18-year-old Marina and 15-year-old Petra. The other sister, Sabine, she was over at the doctor's villa. She was staying with him for a couple of days while she worked there. At some point that afternoon, Dragma and Harold left the living room and went into one of the bedrooms to lie down and take a nap. And after they lie down, Frank, for some reason, gets up from the living room and walks into the bedroom and sits down on the edge of the bed and just stares down at his mother. And when his mother rolls over and looks up at her son, Frank would later tell police that the look she gave him was suggestive and it was offensive to Frank, and he believed she was not permitted to look at him that way. And so in this moment that she's looking at him, he said he instinctively knew that the killing hour was upon them. The killing hour was not a Lorber Society concept. It was something that Frank and most likely Harold had come up with, and the rest of the family, the mother and the 3 sisters, had totally accepted. According to Frank and Harold, women were impure, and the only way to purify them, i.e. send them to heaven and not hell, was to murder them. And so it was just fundamentally understood in the Alexander household that at some point, Frank was going to declare that the killing hour was upon them. And when that happened, all the women in the household were told to stop what they were doing and wait for Frank to sacrifice them. Meaning, wait for Frank to ritualistically kill them. So after Frank has seen this offensive look on his mother's face, he now feels like the killing hour is upon them, and so he literally announces it to his mother and to his father, who's right next to her, and then Frank grabs a nearby wooden coat hanger and strikes his mother on the top of her head. Now, his mother, she's heard that the killing hour is upon them, and he's starting to beat her, and so what does she do? She follows the rules. She flips herself over onto her stomach, puts her hands down by her side, and lays flat and still so Frank can more easily kill her. And so Frank begins wailing on the back of his mother's head with this wooden coat hanger, while his father, Harold, excitedly leaps out of the bed, doesn't try to stop what's going on. He runs into the living room and he begins very enthusiastically playing the organ. An organ is like a piano that's played a lot of times inside of Christian churches. And so with all this commotion going on in the house, the other two sisters that were there, Marina and Petra, they come out of their bedrooms into the living room. They see their father playing the organ, and they look into the bedroom where they hear all this noise, and it's Frank murdering their mother. And they're looking at this happening. They're not doing anything. They're just staring at it. And then their father says to them, "The killing hour is upon us. You need to get ready." And so the girls, when they hear this, they know the rules. And so they stop watching this attack, and they make their way over to the center of the living room, and they sit down cross-legged, and they begin to patiently wait their turn. After a while, Frank stopped beating his mother, who was now unconscious or perhaps even dead, and he walked out of the bedroom into the living room where he saw his father on the organ, and he saw his two sisters sitting on the ground. And so without any hesitation, he walks over to Marina, the older one, the 18-year-old, and he begins hitting her on the top of the head until she slouches over onto the ground motionless. And then he turns to the younger one, Petra, the 15-year-old, and he does the same thing to her until she's laying on the ground motionless. After this, Frank stands up and he leaves the living room and goes into the kitchen where he retrieves a small knife, pruning shears, and a hammer. At this point, it's likely that one or two of the Alexander women were still alive. And so Frank, he comes back into the living room with these tools in hand, and with the organs blaring in the background, he begins to systematically hack off the breasts and genitals of his two sisters and his mother. And apparently this was a very slow and physically difficult task, and so he and his father Harold began switching off. One person would be on the organs while the other was mutilating, and they would switch back and forth until all of the offending parts on these three women had been removed and nailed to the wall. The last mutilation this father and son committed was to cut the heart out of the mother, Dragma, and they wrapped it up in a cord and then nailed this cord to the wall as well. Then, with the three Alexander women either dead or close to death, the father and son began running around the apartment, yelling and singing and rejoicing. They were extremely proud of what they had just done. Later that night, they left the apartment and slept in another property that they owned, and then the following day, December 22nd, they went to the doctor's villa to tell Sabine the good news. And so they knock on the door, the doctor answers, he goes back and gets Sabine. Sabine walks up, and Harold, her father, says to her, "Sabine, we wanted to tell you right away that Frank and I have just finished killing your mother and your sisters." To which Sabine walks up to him, takes her father's hand, presses it to her cheek, and says, "I'm sure you did what was necessary." This, of course, is what the doctor saw and overheard that was so horrible and prompted him to call the police. It was also the moment when he realized that was not mud all over these two men. That was their family members' blood. Psychiatrists would ultimately determine that Frank and Harold were not mentally fit to stand trial, and so they were both committed to an asylum for the criminally insane. Both men never showed any remorse or regret about what they had done. In fact, they continued to justify their actions by saying, because of them, these three women got to go to heaven. As for the one surviving daughter, Sabine, she pleaded with authorities to let her go live with her brother and her father in this asylum, but they rejected this request and sent her to live in a convent, which is a building that nuns live in, and no one really knows what happened to her after that. Shockingly, in 1990, so roughly 20 years after Frank and Harold were put into this asylum, they managed to escape, and they were never caught. To this day, their whereabouts remain unknown.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Someone in This Family Has a Secret. Strongsville, Ohio used to be just another typical quiet American suburb. Nice homes, nice families, nice restaurants, and a mall. But in late 2017, a discovery was made in Strongsville that put this town on the map in the worst way possible. To understand this discovery, we need to go back to early 2016 when this town's nightmare began. In early 2016, two longtime Strongsville residents, Bruce and Melinda Pleskovic, received some very exciting news.
Their 20-year-old daughter named Anna and her 20-year-old fiance named Jeff had just told them they were expecting a baby girl. And so Bruce and Melinda were totally excited about the prospect of finally becoming grandparents, but at the same time, they knew Anna and Jeff did not have very much money. Anna still lived at home with Bruce and Melinda. She did have a job, but she made very little money. She was a waitress at a local Applebee's restaurant. And as for Jeff, he had a better job working as a service technician for a heating and air company, but he didn't have enough money to support him and Anna. In fact, he didn't even have enough money to move out of his parents' home. He was still living with them on the other side of Strongsville. And so this couple, they're really excited about their baby, but Bruce and Melinda are thinking, we really got to find a way to support them because they're just not prepared for this first child. And so Bruce and Melinda, they talked it over and they decided the best way to support this young couple was to tell their daughter if she wanted to, she could invite Jeff to come stay at their house. That way, the two of them could be together, and once they had their daughter, Bruce and Melinda could be the great-grandparents and help take care of the baby, and in general, this would allow the couple to just continue to save money and move out when they were ready. And so when they told Anna they were willing to do this, Anna was so happy, she was so grateful. She called Jeff, and Jeff was equally happy and grateful and said, yes, I would love to move in with you guys. So it took several months, but finally in June of 2016, which was the same month that Jeff and Anna welcomed their daughter to the world, Jeff would leave his parents' home and move into Bruce and Melinda's home. And almost immediately after he moved in, he and the rest of Anna's family began experiencing some very strange and disturbing things around their property. Just a few days after Jeff had moved in, he and Anna were home alone. They were on the main floor of the house and they were having dinner at the kitchen table. And at some point, Jeff just happened to glance out one of the back windows that looked out into their backyard. And now this property had this huge sprawling backyard. Basically, they had all these houses kind of in a row and they all had almost like a communal backyard, this big open space. And so Jeff is looking out into this huge backyard and he sees off in the distance something strange. He doesn't really know what he's looking at because it's nighttime, it's dark, but he stands up and he walks over to the window. And as he's looking out, he sees way off on the backside of their property are these four strangers just standing there appearing to be smoking something. And they're just kind of looking up at the Pleskovic house. And so Jeff is looking out the window at these four, not really sure what to make of them. And he calls Anna over. And so Anna walks over and the two of them are looking out, not really sure what to do. I mean, on the one hand, these four people who they clearly didn't know, or they believed they didn't know, were definitely trespassing. But at the same time, they weren't really doing anything. They were just kind of standing there smoking. But as they're watching these four people, one of them begins walking up the property towards their home and then stops alongside the Pleskovic trampoline, which was in their backyard. And this person begins fiddling with the trampoline. And so at this, Anna's like, you know what? I don't know what they're doing. I feel totally uncomfortable. And so Anna would actually call the police. And so the police, they come out, but by the time the squad car arrived in front of the Pleskovic house, the four people in back must have seen the car and they took off running. And so when the police officer went in the backyard and looked around, there was no one there. And there was also no sign they were there. There was no dropped cigarette butts or anything. They just kind of vanished. And so the police officer told Jeff and Anna, if they come back, let us know. And so the officer left. And then a little while later, when Bruce and Melinda came home, Jeff and Anna would tell them about what happened. And they would agree that that was totally strange, that in all the decades they had lived in Strongsville, they had never had anybody stroll onto their property and just loiter in the middle of the night. And so for the next couple of days, the family was definitely on edge. But after a little while, this whole incident was largely forgotten about. Fast forward about 5 months to November 2016, and Anna was home alone with her young daughter, and she's playing with her daughter on the first floor of the house towards the front of the house. And as she's playing with her daughter, she suddenly hears what sounds like someone trying to open the back sliding glass door on the back of the house. And so instinctively, Anna thinks, okay, Jeff must be out there or my parents must be out there and they don't have a key or something. And so she scoops up her daughter and she begins walking towards the back of the house to open this door for them. And when she walks into one of the back rooms, before she reaches the back door, she happens to look out one of the windows that looked out into the backyard. And standing right up against the glass is this unknown male figure with his face pressed up against the glass. And so Anna just freezes and stares at this guy. And then this guy, he notices Anna and he ducks down out of view. And now Anna's thinking to herself, this is the guy. He must have been trying to break in my back door. I'm home alone. I don't know what's going on here. I don't know if he's going to try to break in again. And so she just turns and runs back towards the front of the house. She runs upstairs. She goes in a bedroom. She locks the door and she calls the police. But by the time the police come out there and they look around, they can't find this unknown figure that was at the back of the house, and there's no sign of an attempted forced entry. And so unfortunately, they told her, look, I'm sure this was very traumatic for you, but there's really nothing we can do here. There's no evidence to suggest who did this. And so please just, keep your house locked. And if you see anybody suspicious on your property, call us back. And so naturally, after the police left and Anna had a chance to contact Jeff and her parents, they were horrified and they rushed home to comfort her. And then after the initial shock of this incident had worn off, the family began to speculate, do you think this might be connected to those 4 strangers we saw on our property a few months ago? It just seems odd that those 2 things would happen so close together. And then the family began to think, okay, well then who is this person? Who are these people? What do they want? Why are they targeting us? What's going on? Because as it was, the Pleskovic family, they didn't have any enemies, at least none that they knew of. If anything, the people of Strongsville adored this family, especially Melinda, the mother. For the past 20 plus years, she had been a middle school teacher in town and her students adored her. She was also a big-time soccer coach in the community because she had played in college and she was still very passionate about it. So she was this amazing coach. And in the eyes of many parents in the Strongsville community, Melinda was a bit of an inspiration because she was not only the mother to Anna, she was also the mother of an 18-year-old boy named Kyle who had Down syndrome and was nonverbal. And Melinda just had this unbelievable way with him where she was so good to him. She incorporated him in everything. She got him so involved. She gave him the best life he could possibly have. And so anytime you saw Kyle with his mother, Kyle would be all smiles. Even though Kyle couldn't speak, it was so obvious his mother made him incredibly happy. But regardless of the reason for these strangers to be lurking around their property, the Pleskovic family was now totally on edge and found themselves constantly looking out the windows, especially at night, in fear these strangers were going to come back and might try to break in again. And unfortunately, these strangers would come back. In January of 2017, so 2 months after Anna saw that unknown figure at the window and heard the back door sliding around, Bruce's car was broken into. It was sitting in the driveway of their property. Someone got inside of it and stole his laptop. And so Bruce, he calls the police and he says, I've got to believe this has to do with the people that are harassing my family. And the police believed him and they began looking around and asking around, but they could never track down the laptop or the thief. And so once again, the family was kind of left on their own. And the police said, look, if you see anything else, let us know, but there's not much we can do here. A few months later, in July of that year, Anna, Jeff, and their daughter were all home together one night when Anna happened to look out one of the back windows on their first floor, and out on the very back of the property were 3 strangers just standing in that same spot where they saw those 4 strangers smoking the year before. And these 3 strangers are just standing there looking up at the house. And so horrified, Anna calls out to Jeff and says, look, there are 3 people in the back of our property. And so Anna, she pulls out her phone and she's calling the police. And as she's calling the police, Jeff, who's totally upset that there are these people harassing him and his family and making them feel unsafe, he just grabs a flashlight and storms out the back door to go confront these people. But as soon as Jeff went out the back door, before he could even shine the light on them, the 3 people had turned and ran and vanished. And so finally, when the police did show up, they were aware of all the calls they had gotten from this family. And so they went out there and they did a serious search for these 3 strangers. But like always, nothing was found. And so the family once again was told, if you see anything else, let us know. The following month, which was August, Anna was home with her daughter, along with her mother, who was upstairs. And as Anna is in the front of the house in the playroom with her daughter, she hears the sound of somebody trying to open that back sliding door. And now immediately her radar is up because she knows what happened the last time she heard the sound. There was that person in the window. But she's thinking, okay, I can't just immediately call the police. I need to at least look and see if there's someone that I know at the back door. And so she scoops her daughter up, she stands up, and she walks around to the edge of the room she's in, and she kind of peeks her head down this hallway that will give her a clear view of this backsliding glass door. And once she finally has a full view of whoever is there, she screams because there are two large adults, as she would say, standing at the back door trying to force open this door. And so when she screams, these two strangers, they hear it, they turn around and they run. And Melinda, she was upstairs, she hears her daughter screaming, she comes flying downstairs, she's trying to figure out what's going on. Anna is hysterical, the baby's crying. And so Melinda actually calls the police about what her daughter has just seen. The police come out, they search the property, they can't find anyone. And so again, the police leave and they tell the family, look, I'm sorry this is happening to you, but we can't do anything. So please just let us know if anything else happens and we'll be out here as soon as we can. We're bound to catch these people, but right now we just don't have much to operate on. The following month, which was September, one of Melinda's car keys would go missing. And whoever had these keys, whoever had stolen these keys, would use it to randomly start Melinda's car in the middle of the night. And they also used it to set off her car alarm at odd hours of the night. And then also during this time frame that her keys were missing, they also discovered that there were nails jammed into the tires of Bruce's car. And so, of course, the family calls the police and tells them about what's going on, but the police can't do anything. And so very frustrated, Melinda actually takes to Facebook and posts that someone's stolen her keys and please just give them back. And just overall, she's pleading with whoever is harassing her family to just leave them alone. But unfortunately, this post would not do anything. The harassment would continue. A month later, on October 19th, Jeff was home alone when he heard the sound of the backsliding glass door rattling, and now he knows that every time this has been heard by Anna, that there's always some stranger at the back door. And so Jeff grabs the family dog and he very carefully turns and looks down that hallway towards the back door to see who this is. And right as he pokes his head out, he sees there's this large adult figure with a hood up trying to open this back door. And so the dog sees this person and starts barking and running towards the door. Jeff runs after the dog, and this big person outside who's trying to break in, he sees the dog, he sees Jeff running, and he turns and he runs away. And so Jeff and the dog, they stay inside the house and they watch this guy just take off across the property and disappear into the trees. And Jeff would call the police, but like always, the police came out and there just was nothing they could do. 4 days later, on October 23rd, Jeff, along with his young daughter and Bruce, they went to the local Applebee's where Anna worked to have dinner there and have Anna wait on them. And then after they were done eating, they said their goodbyes to Anna, they left the restaurant, they hopped in their cars, and they drove back to their house. When they got there, Bruce was the first up the steps, and he got to the front door and it was locked, and so he knocked. And Kyle, his son, he came and unlocked the door. Bruce went inside, followed closely behind by Jeff, who was holding his daughter. They get inside, and Bruce walks through the house to the back of the house where the kitchen is. He flips on the lights, and there's something on the kitchen floor. And when Jeff sees it, he immediately turns around and runs out of the house carrying his daughter. He grabs Kyle along the way and just takes them straight out of the house. And then once Jeff was outside, he called 911. And when you listen to his 911 call, it sounds like Jeff is unable to process what he has just seen.
911, what's the address of your emergency?
Somebody's been attacked in my house.
Somebody's been what?
Attacked.
They attacked who? Who was attacked?
Mel Pleskovic. Mel Pleskovic was attacked.
He was attacked by whom? Do you know?
She was. No, we just came home. She's on the kitchen floor.
Jeff and Bruce had just discovered Melinda lying on the kitchen floor. She'd been stabbed over 35 times and shot 3 times. She would be rushed to the hospital, but she would die that night. Although the family was in shock and couldn't even begin to process what had just happened, they were all acutely aware that whoever had done this to Melinda had to be connected to all of these strange and suspicious people that had been lurking around their property for the better part of 2 years. In fact, literally after Jeff had called 911, Bruce was inside in the kitchen kneeling next to his dying wife, and he called 911 and he would tell the dispatcher that the Strongsville Police Department really dropped the ball.
911, what city is the emergency in?
Please come to 1 Blazing Star. I think my wife's dead. We've had people breaking into our f***ing house,
Sir.
and now someone killed her.
Sir, tell me the city you need to talk to.
Strongsville, Ohio.
Okay, you need to be transferred. Don't hang up.
911, what's the city of your emergency?
Strongsville, Ohio. We have people on the way already.
What's the address?
4 Blazing Star. I think someone killed my wife.
You think someone killed your wife?
Yeah, it looks like she has stab wounds on her back. We've had people trying to break into our house all year.
Sir,
stealing.
Sir, I need to ask you questions, okay? Are you there right now?
I just got in the door with my new son-in-law. My son Kyle was here with her.
Sir, what I want you to do is walk out.
The Strongsville Police Department would come out in force for this case, and they would solve it in just 4 days. And when they went public with who killed Melinda, no one could believe it. Back on October 23rd, so this was the night Melinda was discovered, Jeff, along with his young daughter and Melinda and her son Kyle, they were all together in the house. And at some point, Jeff had put his daughter down in her playpen and then went into the kitchen where Melinda was, and he walked up to her, pulled out a knife, and stabbed her over 35 times. And then when Melinda fell to the ground, Jeff drew a gun and shot her 3 additional times to make sure she was dead. Now, while he was doing this, his daughter is literally just a few feet away, and Kyle, presumably, is also right nearby, but he has no way of understanding what's happening to his mother. And so with these 2 totally innocent lives just right nearby, Jeff would clean off his weapons and he'd take off his bloody clothes and he would hide them inside of his car, and then he would just scoop up his daughter and he would leave the house, leaving Kyle alone in the house with his dying mother in the kitchen, just leaves him there, shuts the door, locks it, and then Jeff and his daughter would drive to Applebee's to have dinner with Melinda's husband and her daughter. And then after several hours, when they got back to the property, Jeff knew what was waiting for them inside, and he still allowed Bruce to go inside first and discover his dying wife on the kitchen floor. Very little is known about why Jeff did this, because Jeff has actually never come out and given his motive for the crime. The running theory is that Jeff actually was not going to be able to pay for the wedding, which was coming up in a couple of days, and the wedding venue had actually contacted Melinda and said, hey, we're canceling the wedding because your future son-in-law can't pay for it. And so Melinda apparently confronted Jeff about his financial troubles, and the theory is he snapped and killed her. However, that can't possibly be the entire story for why he did this, because it would turn out Jeff was found to be responsible for literally every single suspicious event that had taken place around the Pleskovic property leading up to the attack. Meaning every time they had seen strangers lurking around their property or people trying to break into their house, that had been because of Jeff. Either it was literally Jeff outside being one of these suspicious people, or he had asked friends or hired someone or groups of people to pretend to be suspicious people on the property, or Jeff had been the only person to see these suspicious people, and then miraculously when other people attempted to look outside, they were gone. And so obviously Jeff was lying. And so I actually had the opportunity to speak with one of Jeff's childhood friends who was actually living roughly in the Strongsville area when this horrible murder took place. And what this person told me is that what is kind of generally accepted as why Jeff did this, according to the people in Strongsville, is that Jeff apparently loathed Melinda. Even though she had opened her house to him, he loathed her. And as soon as he moved in 2016, he began plotting to kill her. And so all of these suspicious events were Jeff's attempt at building this really intricate alibi that they had these strangers out there that were targeting this family. And so that when she would ultimately be killed by him, it would look like these strangers had done it. And at first, it totally worked. Everybody believed, the police, the family, friends, that strangers had broken into the house and killed Melinda. In fact, there was so little suspicion on Jeff after her murder that Jeff actually served as a pallbearer in Melinda's funeral. But ultimately, the police would discover the knife and some bloody clothes in the back of Jeff's car, and so they would arrest him and they would present this mountain of evidence against him, and Jeff would confess to killing Melinda. However, he wouldn't give any additional information about the crime. He would just basically say, yes, I did kill her. He would also never give an apology or explanation to the family. He would ultimately be sentenced to life in prison with the opportunity for parole after 33 years. During Jeff's trial, there was this totally heartbreaking moment when Bruce, Melinda's husband, spoke, and he would say their son, Kyle, does not understand that his mother is gone. And so now, every time they go out to eat, which is something Kyle really likes to do and he used to love doing with his mother, he'll just sit and stare out the window, eagerly expecting his mother to show up any minute. But of course, she never does. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to curl the 5-star review button's hair for their wedding, but then repeatedly touch the top of their ear with the curling iron. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. On a chilly night in March of 2012, a wiry 56-year-old man with a patchy beard trudged through a backyard in rural Iowa with his coat pulled tight around him, dragging something very heavy behind him. He reached the fence and he paused, scanning the darkness to confirm that he was alone. His gaze fell on the trailer home on the opposite side of the fence. The lights were on, and he could hear the young couple inside arguing. The sound made his jaw clench. He turned around and looked at the thing he'd been dragging. Holding his breath and clenching a pack of zip ties in his teeth, he lifted it against the fence post. He worked quickly, using the zip ties to string it up. And once it was secure, On May 25, 2012, 23-year-old Lisa Teckel, who was pregnant with her first child, sat in the passenger seat of her husband's beat-up pickup truck as he sped through the rural backroads of Agency, Iowa. Lisa and her husband Seth both had the morning off, and so they were running some errands around town. When the truck suddenly jolted over a pothole, Lisa winced and threw her hands over her belly. Seth apologized and promised to replace the shocks soon, but Lisa just rolled her eyes at him. She told him it wasn't the truck, it was Seth's driving, and she joked that if their baby was going to ride with him, they'd better invest in a top-notch car seat. Lisa was 17 weeks along with a baby girl, and already she and Seth had decided to name her Zoe Maria, and Lisa had already begun saying the name out loud just to hear how it felt. As Lisa ticked off the things they still needed to buy, including a bassinet, diapers, and a stroller, Seth let out an anxious groan. Their baby wasn't even born, and she was already costing a fortune. But Lisa reminded him that they would have the money soon. After all, Seth was about to start a new job in just a couple of weeks. The new job was thanks to Lisa's dad, who worked as a deputy at the local sheriff's office and had helped to get Seth a spot at the jail. Lisa was in the same line of work herself, already working as a corrections officer at a prison in the next county over. And while being a corrections officer was not exactly exciting or glamorous to either Lisa or Seth, it was steady, and it gave both of them a real shot at eventually moving up to deputy positions down the line. And so just thinking about the job reminded Lisa that Seth still had not thanked her father yet for getting him this job. And so Lisa dialed his number, and sure enough, her dad, Todd Caldwell, picked up at the first ring. Lisa switched to speakerphone and then filled her dad in on the latest from the doctor. The baby was healthy and already fully formed with fingers, toes, and everything. She could hear the joy in her father's voice as he told them, for what had to be the 100th time, how excited he was to become a grandpa. At some point, Seth chimed in to thank him for the job, but Todd brushed it off, saying Seth had earned it. And it was true. Even though Seth was only 21, he had already gotten an associate degree in criminal justice, he'd interned with the sheriff's office, and he was a volunteer firefighter. And so, slowly but surely, he was building the resume to become a full-blown cop. Seth thanked Todd for the vote of confidence, and Lisa began to say goodbye, since they'd just arrived at their next stop. But before she could hang up, Todd told them that there was actually something serious he wanted to speak to both of them about. He said that his office was getting frequent calls from Seth and Lisa's neighbor, Brian Tate, who kept complaining, without evidence, that Seth and Lisa were vandalizing his property. Todd told them that he didn't trust the guy and that they should really just try to stay clear of him. Lisa promised her dad that she and Seth would be careful. Then she told him that she loved him and ended the call to get out of the truck. Later that evening, after hours of errands and driving around, Seth and Lisa finally reached their home, which was a quiet trailer on a wooded plot just outside of town. They finished unloading the truck, then cuddled up in bed
listening to their baby's heartbeat through a fetal Doppler monitor until they both fell asleep. At 5 a.m. the next morning, Seth was awakened by the sound of his alarm. He still had a few weeks of work left at his current job as a security guard, whereas Lisa was not working today. So Seth switched off the alarm quickly and then climbed out of bed, trying his best not to wake Lisa up. Lisa did stir a little bit, but rolled over onto her side and went back to sleep, while Seth headed down the hall to take a shower and get ready for the day. 20 minutes later, at 5:23 a.m., Deputy Martin Wonderland with the Wapello County Sheriff's Department was on patrol when a call cracked over the radio. There had been a shooting just outside the town of Agency, and when the dispatcher relayed the address and the caller's name, Wonderland's hands tightened on the wheel because he knew Seth Tekel. Wonderland worked with Seth's father-in-law, Todd. Wonderland flicked on his lights and floored it, tires kicking up dust as the cruiser tore through the early morning stillness. When he arrived at the trailer, an ambulance was already waiting outside, which meant that a paramedic had beaten him there. Otherwise, the property seemed perfectly peaceful until Wonderland rounded the side of the trailer and saw Seth on the back porch. Seth was barefoot, shirtless, and sobbing, but the only word that Wonderland could make out was Lisa. Wonderland realized that whoever the shooter was, they could still be nearby. So he ran back to his cruiser, popped open the trunk, pulled out his rifle, and then charged into the trailer. The living room was dark because the blinds were still drawn, and everything looked untouched, with no obvious signs of forced entry. A rack of hunting rifles hung on the living room wall, and gleaming bowling trophies lined the shelf below. For a moment, Wonderland remembered Lisa's father, Todd, mentioning that his daughter had at one point been a state bowling champ in high school. Wonderland moved quietly down the hall, rifle raised, listening for any movement. He saw the bedroom door was open, so he stepped inside, and then he stopped. The bedroom walls were splashed with blood. Lisa lay motionless in the bed. Her chest had been torn open by massive gunshot wounds. The paramedic who had beaten Wonderland to the scene crouched beside her, checking her for a pulse. He looked over at Wonderland and shook his head. Lisa was dead, along with her unborn child. There was a pistol out on the dresser, just sitting there, but one look at it told Wonderland that it was far too small to cause this much damage. Wonderland backed out of the bedroom slowly and cleared the rest of the trailer one room at a time, making sure nobody else was there. Once he was sure it was empty, he returned to his cruiser and locked up his rifle in the trunk. Then he grabbed his radio, which he used to call dispatch, and he asked them to send backup. And he specified that they should notify Badge 58 right away. Badge 58 was Lisa's father, Todd. At that very moment, Todd was at home, fast asleep. He was woken by the phone, and when he answered, he heard the familiar voice of the dispatcher, and he thought it was just a work call. Then they told him that there had been a shooting, and the victim was his daughter, Lisa. Within minutes, Todd was flying across town, praying that there had been some kind of mix-up, and that Lisa was okay. But when he reached her trailer, a small crowd of deputies were scattered across the yard. When they saw Todd, they immediately moved to block his path to the front door. The deputies felt like Wonderland had made a mistake calling him here, because this was not something he needed to see. But the crowd didn't stop Todd. He pushed past his fellow officers into the trailer, and when he got to the bedroom, he took one look at his daughter and burst into tears. Todd stood in the doorway, shaking with ragged sobs. But within moments, his grief became rage, and he stormed back out of the trailer and he howled, "Go get him!" And immediately, the deputies in the yard bolted to their cruisers and started pulling out body armor and slamming magazines into rifles. In seconds, they were geared up and moving in unison toward the house immediately next door to Seth and Lisa. This house belonged to Brian Tate, who was the neighbor that kept calling Todd's office to accuse Seth and Lisa of vandalizing his property. Brian was a 57-year-old Vietnam War veteran who was known to suffer from PTSD and schizophrenia. And so now, Todd was convinced that Brian must have had something to do with his daughter's death, not only because of those calls about vandalism, but also because of something that had happened between Seth, Lisa's husband, and Brian 2 months earlier. Late one night back in March, Seth had been making his way home through the dark streets when he suddenly jammed on the brakes to avoid hitting a deer lying in the middle of the road. Seth got out and inspected the animal and confirmed that it was already dead. Clearly, someone else had hit the deer with their car and just left it there. Seth knew this deer carcass was actually pretty dangerous, and the last thing he wanted was for somebody else to come along here and either run over the deer and create a huge mess, or maybe swerve to avoid it like he had done, but run off the road onto his property. So he dragged the deer carcass to the side of the road right on the curb and onto what was technically the edge of Brian Tate's property, but in reality, the carcass was really basically out on the sidewalk. Then Seth got into his car and drove the very short distance to his home, thinking that was the end of it, that he had done the right thing. But that wasn't the end of it. The next morning, when Seth stepped outside, the deer had been moved from the sidewalk directly into his backyard. Seth realized that Brian must have woken up and found the carcass and been somehow mad about it and tossed it over the fence directly onto Seth's property. This was totally irritating. In Seth's mind, the deer had been hit in front of Brian's place, so really it was Brian's responsibility to deal with it. So Seth grabbed the deer carcass again, which was now noticeably smellier as it was decomposing, and hurled it back over the fence, back onto Brian's property. By the time Seth came home from work that evening, he found the deer carcass in his driveway. And so what did he do? He picked it up again, dragged it over, and tossed it over the fence onto Brian's property. And then the next day, Seth found the carcass literally zip-tied to his fence post. The deer carcass went back and forth, growing more disgusting with each pass, until it was almost falling apart. Eventually, some other animal must have dragged it off, but the feud continued. Brian began patrolling the fence at the edge of his property and would glare at Seth and Lisa whenever he saw them. He accused them of throwing rocks and beer cans at his garage, and when Seth and Lisa denied it, Brian stopped complaining to them and started calling the police instead to report them for vandalism. And then in April of 2012, so just 11 days before Lisa's murder, her father, Todd, had responded to one of those calls himself. He didn't tell Brian that he was Lisa's father, or that he'd already heard all about the deer incident from Lisa. He wanted to genuinely hear Brian out and see what kind of person they were actually dealing with. And Brian had not held back. He'd led Todd around his property, pointing out rocks he swore hadn't been there before, while complaining that Seth and Lisa had committed what he called acts of terrorism against him. He even produced an old coffee can filled with dog feces that he said had been dumped on his porch and on the hood of his car. To Todd, Brian just seemed really paranoid. But as he continued ranting, Todd noticed something else. Just inside of Brian's front door, leaning casually against the wall, was clearly a shotgun. Seeing that gun made Todd nervous, so he tried to calm Brian down and assured him that Seth and Lisa were not out to get him here. He said that they were good people and would not do what he was saying they were doing. But Brian only grew more upset. And eventually, Brian just stalked off away from Todd and went inside his house, slamming the door, and that was the end of the conversation. And so from that moment on, Todd had been convinced that Brian Tate was unstable and dangerous. He had warned his daughter and Seth to steer clear, and he made sure every deputy on the force knew that if they ever got another call involving Brian Tate, they should go in expecting Brian to be the threat. So, on the morning of Lisa's murder, when 4 deputies charged up Brian Tate's driveway, they half expected him to come out shooting. But when they knocked, Brian answered the door completely unarmed, and he seemed perfectly calm. He scratched at his beard, looking around at the deputies through puffy eyes, and then asked them what was going on. The deputies traded nervous glances. They didn't want to give away their suspicions just yet, so they told Brian that unfortunately his neighbor Lisa had been found dead, and that now they were making their rounds to see if anybody had heard or seen anything unusual. Brian stared at them for a long beat, then told the deputies to wait right there. He disappeared back inside his house, then returned with a stack of plastic lawn chairs, which he set out on the lawn. And to the deputies' surprise, for the next 40 minutes, Brian fielded all their questions about everything from his whereabouts that morning to his mental state and his relationship with Seth and Lisa. He told them that he didn't know anything about what happened to Lisa and certainly hadn't heard any gunshots that morning because actually he'd been deeply asleep, sleeping off the effects of the new antipsychotic meds his doctor had him on. The deputies weren't quite sure what to make of him. Brian was surprisingly open, not defensive or jittery, but he also wasn't acting even remotely shocked by the news of Lisa's death. And some of what he said raised serious red flags. For one thing, he kept saying that none of this would have happened if the police had just taken his calls seriously, which of course really made him look quite suspicious because his calls were complaints about Seth and Lisa. And then once he brought up the vandalism, it was like no matter what the deputies asked, Brian would steer the conversation back to the vandalism. He said that before his feud with Seth and Lisa, he'd been Mr. Nice Guy. People had taken advantage of him. Now, he said he was, quote, kind of taking a different approach to life right now, being more serious and more not such a nice guy. Meanwhile, back at Seth and Lisa's trailer home, an evidence retrieval crew had arrived and was busy sweeping the area. Seth was despondent in the driveway, sobbing and punching his own truck until his knuckles bled, while Todd tried his best to calm him down. When one of the deputies swung by to say that Seth had been scheduled for an interview at the sheriff's station, nobody was surprised. Todd and Seth both understood that as Lisa's husband, Seth had to be looked at seriously as a suspect. And so Seth had no issue doing the interview and said he was just eager to get it over with. Once Seth sat down inside of the tiny interview room, he half expected to actually recognize whoever it was that came in to speak to him. After all, he was pretty well connected in town and certainly had a connection to law enforcement. However, the man who walked into the interview room was somebody Seth didn't know. He was clean-shaven and wearing a crisp suit. The man introduced himself as Detective Chris Thomas and said that he was an investigator with the Iowa Department of Criminal Investigation, and he'd been sent to assist with this case. Suddenly, Seth wondered if maybe he'd made a mistake coming here without a lawyer, but Detective Thomas assured him he just needed Seth to walk him through what happened that morning. That was it. So Seth began telling the story, struggling to keep his voice level as he described waking up at 5 a.m. to get ready for work, and how he'd just gotten into the shower when he heard what sounded like a gunshot. Seth said he had jumped out of the shower right away, he had saw the front door open and ran to the bedroom where Lisa was, and he had found her still in bed, but she was moaning. Then he heard a loud thump from the back deck and realized there had to be an intruder. So he grabbed his pistol from the nightstand and raced after them. Seth told Detective Thomas that he fully intended to shoot whoever the intruder was, but when he got to the porch, they were already gone. So he ran back inside to the bedroom and discovered that Lisa was not breathing. And that's when he saw his wife's gunshot wound and realized clearly she'd been shot. He called 911, but by the time the paramedics arrived, she was already dead. As Seth finished the story, emotion overwhelmed him and he broke down. But Thomas didn't offer any comfort. Instead, he began pressing Seth about his marriage and asked if Seth and Lisa had been fighting, or if they were having money problems or extramarital affairs. Without hesitation, Seth looked up and said no, there was nothing like that. But just then, the detective's phone buzzed with an incoming text message, and when the detective glanced down at it, Seth felt a flash of panic as he wondered if maybe the text might be about him. The real reason Seth was nervous, though, is because he knew he had not been 100% honest with this detective. He did have a secret, and he knew that if it came out, it would make him look guilty and also be very embarrassing for Lisa's family. But now he realized that keeping that secret was not going to help his situation, so he decided he would split the difference. He would tell Detective Thomas some truth, the most relevant information, if you will. But he would hold back the details that would offend Lisa's father and frankly embarrass the whole family. And so before the detective could move on to any other subject, Seth said, "Hold on a minute, there was another woman. At least, sort of." For the past few months, Seth said he'd been texting with a coworker named Rachel. They'd hung out a few times after work and had even kissed a handful of times, but that was as far as it had gone. Seth had realized it was wrong and had ended things with Rachel before it turned into a full-blown affair. But Seth had barely even finished the story when Detective Thomas actually stopped him and said he knew that Seth was actually still lying. And that's when Thomas revealed that he had been receiving text messages from another team of officers who were questioning Seth's friends, and that through them, Thomas had learned that Seth kept a secret burner phone. Seth had not just been flirting with Rachel, they'd also been sending each other sexually suggestive photos as well. Seth was stunned. One, that his instinct that those text messages the detective was getting was somehow tied to him, that actually was correct. And two, he hadn't realized how quickly the people around him would talk about him. So now he realized that those minor, embarrassing details he'd hoped to keep hidden were going to make him look that much guiltier. So he changed his story for the second time, and admitted that he had held back information because he was scared of what Lisa's father, Todd, would do if he found out about the sexting. Seth still insisted that he and Rachel had never actually slept together, but he did admit that, yes, there had been racy photos exchanged. And also that no, he had not ended things with Rachel. And yes, Rachel believed Seth was going to leave Lisa to be with her. In fact, Seth admitted that he had told Rachel that Lisa was going to be packing her bags and leaving that very day. The moment the words were out of his mouth, Seth knew how bad it sounded. But by this point, he knew he really didn't have another choice. He had to say what he just said. However, he could see from Detective Thomas's face that damage had been done here. Clearly, he'd messed up by not telling them about the secret phone from the start, and now nothing he said would sound like the truth. Meanwhile, across town, Lisa's father, Todd, still had complete faith in Seth. Todd was home, grieving with Lisa's stepmom and sisters, when the phone rang. It was Deputy Wonderland, calling with an update on Lisa's case. Wonderland started out by telling Todd that Brian Tate, the neighbor, had not been arrested yet, which to Todd was a huge, infuriating surprise. He'd been sure that by this point they would have Brian in cuffs at the station, but before Todd could say anything, Wonderland dropped even worse news. He told Todd that state investigators had taken the reins on the case, and they didn't think Brian was guilty. Instead, they were laser-focused on Seth. When Todd heard that, he did not want to believe it. He trusted Seth like his own son, whereas Brian Tate had always seemed like a ticking time bomb. And he was horrified by the thought that an outside agency was going to come in, misjudge the whole situation, and ruin Seth's life, while letting Brian walk away scot-free. But even as he was thinking that, the cop in Todd said to set his emotions aside and just let the investigation play out. In cases like this one, the husband was typically the one who did it. And as much as Todd wanted to believe this was different, he wasn't naive. And he also had complete faith in the police force. He knew that if the detectives did their job, then Brian would be exposed eventually. So he promised Wonderland that he would keep his distance from Seth for the moment and not try to interfere with the case. The truth would come out soon enough. In the days that followed, as Todd made arrangements for his daughter's funeral, he stayed in close contact with the investigation. Deputies had gone back to Brian Tate's property to ask more questions and look for evidence, but so far, nothing had come of it. As for Tate himself, he continued to be cooperative, letting them inside, showing them his extensive gun collection, and answering their questions without hesitation. As for the crime scene, there really wasn't much evidence there either. As Todd would learn from his colleagues, there were no signs of a break-in at Seth and Lisa's trailer, no strange fingerprints in the bedroom. Lisa's autopsy revealed that her killer was likely standing at the foot of the bed when they shot her, but the gun was still missing. There was only one potentially interesting piece of evidence found at the scene. Half of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich inside of a Ziploc bag had been discovered on the back porch, near the steps leading toward the woods surrounding Seth and Lisa's property. When Todd heard about the sandwich, he really doubted that it was relevant. In his estimation, Seth or Lisa had probably dropped it the day before the murder, so the fact that the investigators were focusing on it showed just how little they had to go on. But then he got word of a new discovery that immediately put the sandwich out of his mind and looked really bad for Seth. The morning after the killing, a Mossberg shotgun was discovered in the tall grass outside of Seth and Lisa's trailer. It had been sent to the lab, and testing confirmed it was a match for the deer slug that ultimately killed Lisa. Now, the shotgun was not Seth's, but it was registered to one of Seth's friends who told detectives he had left it with Seth for safekeeping. When Todd heard this, he tried to find an explanation, some reason why Seth would have forgotten or overlooked something that important, but nothing added up. Because if this was a break-in, if someone else had come into the house to kill Lisa, why wouldn't they bring their own weapon? But Todd couldn't think of an answer, and so for the first time since his daughter's death, he actually considered the possibility that maybe he'd gotten this whole thing wrong. Maybe Brian really was innocent, and Seth was Lisa's killer. While all this was happening, Seth had been lying low at his parents' house. But 4 days after the murder, he headed to the funeral home for Lisa's visitation. Lisa's entire family was there, keeping to the opposite side of the room from where Seth was sitting. It was the first time that Seth and Todd had been in the same space since the morning of the murder, and the shift in mood was unmistakable. Todd would not speak to Seth at all, but Seth noticed he kept glancing in his direction, almost like he couldn't help himself. Seth had already been feeling isolated, but this really cut deeper. Lisa's family had always treated him like one of their own, and now they weren't even meeting his eyes. He stood to the side, unsure of what to do, until he spotted Lisa's little sister. Out of all of Lisa's family members, Seth had been closest to her. So after nervously glancing at her a few times, he got up the courage to cross the aisle and approach her directly. He didn't know how she was going to react, but he was so desperate for a connection that he just walked over, gave her a hug, and then whispered that he loved her and that she would always be his little sister. And when Lisa's little sister said she loved him too, Seth's hope bloomed. He told himself that maybe the cold shoulder he was feeling was just grief and confusion, and that maybe Lisa's family had not given up on him completely. But as the visitation ended and Seth walked out of the funeral home, a county police cruiser was waiting for him. Deputy Wonderland approached him, told Seth to turn around and put his hands behind his back. He was being charged with Lisa's murder. Seth didn't resist. He let Wonderland cuff him and lead him to the car, then just stared out the window as they pulled away from the funeral home. Lisa's family stared right back at him, and in their cold expressions, he could see their doubts hardening. The last thread had snapped. His friends, Lisa's family, the cops he'd once hoped to work alongside, none of them believed him anymore. Seth was alone. But while the state swiftly moved toward a trial against Seth, the media was not ready to let Brian Tate go as a suspect. Local journalists painted Brian as the unhinged neighbor with a stockpile of guns and a history of paranoia. Whenever Lisa's father, Todd, would read one of those stories about Brian, he found himself growing more upset about the case. At the start, he'd been sure Brian was his daughter's killer. But learning about the shotgun in the grass and also Seth's text message affair had really changed his mind. Now, reporters were digging up as much dirt as they could on Brian, but instead of Todd buying into them, he found himself feeling something he hadn't expected: sympathy. After all, Todd had really been the one to flag Brian early on as being unstable and potentially dangerous, and he couldn't help but feel partly responsible for the way the media was now portraying him. And these feelings of guilt only deepened when Todd learned that Brian had been involuntarily committed to a psychiatric facility. The details weren't public, but from what Todd heard, it seemed like the press attention had pushed an already fragile man past his breaking point. And then, on September 30th, when Brian was no longer in the psychiatric facility, he was found dead inside of his home. The autopsy ruled it was natural causes, some kind of sudden cardiac failure. But his elderly mother would tell reporters he had died of a broken heart, that the stress from the media coverage around the case had just destroyed him. And Todd agreed with her. He decided that Brian Tate had become the third victim. He was collateral damage in Seth's murder of Lisa and her unborn daughter. Now, Todd just wanted the trial to start. It finally did on February 18th, 2013, almost a year after Lisa's murder. And just as Todd expected, Seth's lawyers made Brian Tate the centerpiece of their defense. But what Todd did not see coming was how much new evidence the defense had uncovered. Like the fact that just a few days before Lisa's murder, Brian's mother told a neighbor that Brian had stopped taking his medication. This was a major red flag, both because it raised the question of what mental state Brian was in on the day of the murder, and because it seemed to go directly against what Brian had told police, that he didn't hear any gunshots that morning because he was so tired and passed out from sleeping off his medication. If that story was a lie, then it suddenly became a lot easier to envision Brian breaking into Seth and Lisa's trailer in the early morning hours, grabbing a shotgun off the wall, and murdering Lisa in cold blood. But the defense did not just focus on Brian. They argued that the police investigation itself had been sloppy from the start, and pointed out everything from procedural mistakes to leads that had been completely ignored. Most importantly, neither Seth nor Brian Tate had been tested for gunshot residue, which should have been the typical procedure for this kind of shooting. No one had checked the spent shotgun shells for fingerprints either, which could have easily revealed the killer's identity. Then there was the mystery of the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which still hadn't been solved. The investigators had written it off as unrelated to the case, but the defense pointed out that there was a major problem with that line of thinking. Seth and Lisa lived in a wooded area with all kinds of wildlife nearby. If that sandwich had been sitting out overnight, it likely would have been torn apart by animals by dawn. But it wasn't, which suggested it had not been there for very long. If it was dropped that morning before the police arrived, it could have only been left by Lisa's killer. Now, the sandwich itself didn't prove anyone's guilt or innocence, but the defense presented it as emblematic of all the questions that the police could not answer. It looked like the investigators just hadn't bothered to tie up loose ends because they'd made up their minds that Seth was guilty, even though there was no eyewitnesses and no DNA evidence tying him to the murder. Hearing the confusing back and forth, Todd couldn't help but worry that the justice system that both he and his daughter fervently believed in would not give him the answers he so desperately needed. As for Seth, he sat through the debate, listening to all the talk of sandwiches, gunshot residue, and Brian Tate's mental health, feeling the walls close in on him. Lisa's family was glaring at him, clearly trying to get a reaction. His friends had cut off all contact with him, and the town where he'd grown up viewed him as a killer. And so now, his fate rested with 12 strangers. As the jury deliberated, Seth braced for the worst. But when the verdict came back, it wasn't a verdict at all. One juror was holding out, refusing to convict. For Seth, this was like a gift from the heavens. One person in the world had looked at all the evidence and believed him. So the judge declared a mistrial. And then, a few months later, they were back in court. The second trial mirrored the first, with the same arguments and same witnesses. But this time, the numbers shifted. Now, 3 jurors, instead of just 1, wanted to acquit. So the second trial ended with another hung jury. Seth felt like things had to be improving for him, but his lawyers knew how close they'd come to losing. So they decided to go back to the evidence in hopes there was something they'd missed. And sure enough, they struck on something massive. Seth's lawyers discovered that in October of 2011, months before Seth and Lisa's wedding, Lisa had carried out a brief sexual relationship with a coworker named Jason. She and Jason, who was married himself, had even discussed the possibility that he might be the father of her baby. This new information gave Jason a powerful motive to want to keep his affair secret from his own wife. And, just as important, this new information showed once again that the police had screwed up. They must have seen text messages on Lisa's phone that hinted at the affair, and so their failure to properly investigate the lead was just more proof that they'd been gunning for Seth from the start and had failed to consider other possible suspects. During the third trial, Lisa's family was forced to sit and listen as Lisa's most shameful secrets were exposed in front of everyone. It was especially devastating for her father, Todd, since he'd always been close to Lisa and thought she told him everything, but not this. But the third trial wasn't over yet, and soon, one more witness was called to the stand. The court was silent as this witness took the stand and got sworn in. And as they did, the witness glanced around nervously the whole time. And from the moment the witness actually started speaking, Todd realized he finally knew, beyond a reasonable doubt, who actually killed his daughter. Based on At 5 a.m. that morning, before the first rays of dawn began spilling over the trees, the killer stood outside of Seth and Lisa's trailer. They paced back and forth in the fading darkness, a cigarette trembling between their fingers. They knew they could not let this go any longer. Something had to change now. So, finally making up their mind, they tossed the cigarette, climbed the steps to the trailer, and slipped inside. The killer moved through the living room, eyes adjusting to the dim interior. The shotgun was right there on the rack. They took it down, loaded it with slow, deliberate movements, and then crept toward the bedroom, where Lisa lay sleeping. The killer hesitated, reminding themselves that it was not too late to stop. They could put the gun back and walk away. Instead, they raised the shotgun and pulled the trigger. As the sound rang in their ears, the killer bolted, terrified that someone had heard. They ran down the hallway, out the back door, across the porch, and into the woods behind the trailer. Breathing hard, they reached the tree line where they found a patch of tall grass and ditched the gun there. For a moment, they just stood there, doing their best to try to compose themselves. Then, at some point, they turned around, took a deep breath, and walked calmly back through the woods, climbed the porch steps, took out their phone, and dialed 911. The killer did not worry for a moment that they were actually going to get caught, because they knew exactly who to blame for the murder. If everything went as planned, the police would take the bait and never guess the truth. And it might have worked, except for one witness who came forward during Seth's third trial. The witness whose explosive testimony finally cleared away all doubts was one of Seth's friends, who admitted to vandalizing Brian Tate's property on Seth's orders. They dumped buckets of dog feces directly onto Brian's porch and also smeared them across the hood of his car. It turned out that Seth had goaded Brian into a feud that made him look crazy and dangerous. And so when Lisa wound up murdered, Seth knew that everyone would assume Brian was the killer, because Seth killed Lisa. He did it because he wanted to be with Rachel, and because, in the days leading up to the murder, Rachel had begun pulling away. And so Seth decided to murder Lisa, both so that he could be free to be with Rachel, and so that he wouldn't have to start his new life owing child support. During the third moment, he winked and told her it was a good one, before plopping down on the couch and showing their granddaughter another ornament from the box. Susie smiled. She was so happy that Rick got to have these moments with their granddaughter. When their own kids had been young, Rick had worked a lot at his accounting job. This had allowed the family to live in a big house in an exclusive neighborhood, but it had also meant that Rick missed out on a lot. He'd spent long hours at the office while Susie stayed home with their kids, Sarah and Andrew. And so it was Susie who had gotten to go to all of Sarah's cheerleading pep rallies and take Andrew on fishing trips. But now that Rick worked from home and so had more time, it was his turn now with their granddaughter. Just then, Susie heard the door open and a voice call out. Seconds later, Sarah walked into the room. Sarah first gave her little girl a big hug, then she stood and greeted Susie and Rick. But right away, Susie noticed that Sarah looked worried. Susie asked her what was up, and Sarah sort of looked down and said sort of sheepishly that she'd gotten another bill. Susie knew that the bill Sarah must be referring to was a legal bill, and it wouldn't be the last. Sarah was right in the middle of a custody battle with her ex-husband, Todd, and Susie and Rick were funding it. Which Susie was more than willing to do, because she knew Sarah was a great mom and they wanted to continue seeing their granddaughter as much as they could. But this whole mess was not the first time Sarah's problems had put a lot of stress on the family. Sarah used to be sort of a typical kid, she was an outgoing, bubbly cheerleader with lots of friends and just did typical teenage girl things. But then by the end of her teen years, she really began leaning into partying and also dating older men. At one point, towards the end of high school, Susie and Rick had even kicked her out of the house. But unfortunately, that had backfired because Sarah had moved in with her ex-husband, Todd, and gotten pregnant. And their relationship resulted in lots of mental health struggles for Sarah and also some substance abuse. But the whole family had still gotten through it, and now Sarah was 25 years old and doing much better. And they had their beautiful granddaughter. So Susie just swallowed down her own complicated feelings about Sarah's newest legal bill and just smiled at her daughter. She told her not to worry about it, she and her father would pay for it. Sarah was visibly relieved and thanked her mother and father. And then not long after that, the family decided to head out for dinner. And at that point, Susie dashed upstairs to let her other child, her 19-year-old son Andrew, know that they were leaving. Andrew still lived at home because he had been going to a community college nearby. However, when Susie got up to his room, she found it was empty. And Susie just shook her head, trying her best to suppress her bitter disappointment. But ultimately, she really wasn't surprised by his absence, because Andrew lately had been spending more and more time out of the house. Andrew had always been a pretty quiet kid, but lately he'd been getting so frustrated and mad so easily and basically fought with everybody in the family constantly. And then, just this past fall, Susie had found out that her son had secretly dropped out of community college, even though she and her husband had just bought him a car for having kept up his grades. And ever since, the mood in the house had been tense, to say the least. So Andrew, probably to get away from that tense feeling, had been spending more and more time out of the house with his girlfriend Chelsea. And so Susie figured that must be where he was now, out with Chelsea, which was sort of a bummer to Susie, because he'd slipped out without saying anything to anyone, even though they had all talked about how after dinner that night, the family was going to decorate the Christmas tree. which was a family tradition, and it looked like he wouldn't be there. But there was nothing she could do, so Susie sighed, left the room, and headed downstairs. Hours later, the family was back at home after having dinner and after decorating the Christmas tree, and Rick and Susie were playing a board game with Sarah and their granddaughter. And they were having a nice time until Sarah finally stood up and announced that she was tired and needed to get her daughter off to bed. And just a few minutes after that, they had left the house, and suddenly the house felt really quiet. Susie looked around the room, which was now a Christmas wonderland after all the decorating they had done. They'd covered the stair banister and the fireplace mantle with wreaths, and the tree was all lit up and bright. There were even presents already under the tree, wrapped and ready for their kids and granddaughter. Susie took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of brownies that she had taken out of the oven just a little bit ago. They were Andrew's favorite, but Andrew was not here. Susie asked Rick if he wanted a brownie, but he didn't answer. And when she looked up, she saw that Rick was starting to doze off on the couch. So she suggested that they both just go upstairs and go to bed. But hours later, Susie lay in bed, completely awake. She still had a million things on her mind, like other presents she still had to buy and the errand she had to run for the party with the neighbors that was coming up later that week. She tossed and turned a bit longer, but when she just could not sleep, she finally just got up and went downstairs, turned on the TV, and laid down on the couch. And sure enough, not long after laying down and suddenly being surrounded by the sparkle of Christmas lights, Susie felt tired and finally drifted off to sleep. Around 24 hours later, at 11:40 p.m. on December 11th, a 911 operator sat at their post in the Mansfield police station. They were nearing the end of their shift, so they were tired and bleary-eyed. But they snapped back into focus when a call came in. They picked it up and clearly announced themselves, but there was no answer from the caller. However, this wasn't really unusual to the operator. Calls like this are referred to as silent calls and are often an accident or a prank. But a caller who doesn't say anything could also be in danger and may be unable to speak. So the operator followed protocol and looked up the phone number the call was being made from and was able to get an address, 820 Turnberry Drive, Mansfield, Texas. And as soon as the operator had that location, they sent a message to the officers on duty requesting that somebody go to the scene and just make sure everything was okay. Just 4 minutes later, 3 officers pulled up to 820 Turnberry Drive. And they didn't need to do much investigating to see that they were clearly in a wealthy part of town. This was an exclusive neighborhood called Walnut Estates, and the street was lined with all these big, beautiful houses. And number 820 was no exception. It was a sprawling 2-story brick home that was clearly getting a jump on Christmas because it was already covered in holiday lights. However, those lights were currently off, and the house was dark. It was close to midnight, so the officers guessed the homeowners must have accidentally dialed the emergency line and not known it, and then gone to sleep, not realizing what they had done. Regardless, the officers got out of their cruiser and went to the front door to knock and ring the doorbell. And when nobody answered, they went around the side of the house and began to look in the windows, but they couldn't see much, and they also couldn't hear any movement coming from inside. And this did put them a bit on edge, because somebody had to have been home in order to call 911 a few minutes ago, and whoever it was, even if it was by mistake, now wasn't answering. So the officers decided they did need to get inside this house, because now they were thinking, it was possible that somebody could be injured and maybe unable to respond. When they tried the front door, they found it was locked, so they walked around to look for a way in, and they saw the attached garage door was open. So they opened it up, stepped inside, and called out. Nobody answered, so they kept walking into the house. And as they kept walking into the house, they began to hear this low-pitched electronic droning sound. The officers shined their flashlights through the dark and followed the sound into the kitchen. And there, on the counter, was the source of that droning sound. It was the receiver of a landline phone that had been left off its hook. At this point, the officers drew their weapons. They didn't know what was going on, but it felt suspicious enough that they should be on guard. As they made their way out of the kitchen, they moved quickly and quietly, because they really weren't sure what was waiting for them in the rest of the house. But even with their guards up, they were not ready for the scene they stumbled onto in the living room. At first glance, even in the dark, it was clear this room was destroyed. And then as their eyes began to adjust, they saw the room was also covered with blood. There were huge pools of it soaked through the carpet in front of the fireplace, and lamps and furniture had been overturned and spattered with more blood. And then one of the police officer's flashlight beams landed on the couch, there, under a blanket that was also soaked with blood, was the body of a woman. For a second, none of the officers said anything. Then, another officer shined his flashlight around the room in a slow circle until the light fell on the body of a man, lying face down only a few feet away. 2 victims, both almost certainly dead. The officers called for backup. Not long after that backup call went out, the detective on call for the Mansfield Police Department, Ralph Standifer, stood in the front yard of 820 Turnberry Drive, staring up at the home. All the lights were on inside, and uniformed officers had pulled crime scene tape around the perimeter. Outside, flashing police and ambulance lights lit up the street as crime scene techs geared up to begin their job. Standifer rubbed his eyes. He'd been with the department for almost 20 years, but it was still hard to get used to being woken up from a deep sleep by his pager. He was there with another detective, Mark Kelly. They'd already been briefed on the situation. The home was owned by a couple in their 40s named Rick and Susie Wamsley, and they both appeared to have been shot to death. Now, Standifer hadn't even stepped foot in the house yet, but he already knew there was a lot about this case that didn't make sense. Officers had gone to the scene because of a 911 call that came in less than an hour ago, but it didn't seem like Rick or Susie had made that call. Judging by the state of their bodies, they'd been dead for a lot longer than that. Standifer assumed, this meant that the killer must have made the 911 call, either because they lingered in the home after killing them and then made the call, or they left the scene and then returned at some point to make that 911 call. Standifer knew that, it was possible that somebody else, who was not the killer, could have anonymously made the call after discovering the bodies, but that felt far-fetched. Like, why would that person not stay and at least give more information to police? And so Standifer was hoping that once he got inside and looked around, things would make more sense. Standifer and Kelly walked up to the home and pulled plastic booties over their shoes before entering. Once inside, they split up. Kelly went through each room taking video, while Standifer just did a walkthrough of the entire crime scene. Standifer first stopped to examine the front door, and he didn't see anything that indicated it had been forced open. And as he walked through the home, he didn't notice any other doors or windows that showed evidence of forced entry either. However, that was where the killer's smoothness ended. The whole scene was an incredible mess. There was a ton of bloody shoe prints all over the place. There were some bloody fingerprints on the wallpaper in the dining room. There was a knife blade that was missing its handle on the carpet. And then, of course, there was the living room, where it looked like an intense, bloody, horrible fight had taken place. In addition to the overturned furniture, there was also a lot of blood splatter and splotches that indicated whoever was bleeding had fallen multiple times. But despite the mess, there wasn't anything obviously missing. The TV was still there were still wrapped presents under the tree, and there weren't any open drawers or closets, which you would have expected if somebody was here looking for something to steal. So Standifer did not think this was a robbery gone wrong. He turned to look at the couch where the woman still lay under the blanket. This was Susie Wamsley. She'd been shot in the head, but her blanket had been pulled up and her expression was almost peaceful, which suggested she might have died while she was still asleep. But this didn't track with the rest of her wounds, because whoever had shot her had apparently also stabbed her repeatedly in the neck and torso. It was clear she hadn't struggled though, which suggested she likely was the first one shot. But that meant the killer stabbed her after she was already dead. It was unusual for a killer to use multiple weapons like that, but it also lined up with the rest of the very chaotic crime scene. Whoever did this was clearly frenzied and highly emotional. Standifer frowned and moved away from Susie towards his other victim, her husband, Rick Wamsley. Rick's body was shirtless, so right away, Standifer saw that he too had been attacked with multiple weapons. He was covered in slashing wounds, and he'd been shot at least once in the head. But unlike Susie, it was clear to Standifer that Rick had fought with his killer. Rick's fist was clenched tightly, and Standifer saw there were actually a few pieces of hair wrapped around Rick's fingers. And so Standifer put on some gloves, and then he knelt down and he opened up Rick's hand to find strands of dark, long hair inside of his palm. And next to Rick's hand on the carpet was a broken blue hair clip. Standifer knew this could be something major, because at least at first glance, it appeared like in Rick's final moments of life, he had managed to grab the hair of his killer and rip some of it out. And this was incredibly lucky, because it meant they would now have an actual piece of forensic evidence, this hair, to test against any suspects that they had. But the evidence was also kind of confusing, because the long hair and the feminine-looking clip suggested that Rick had been fighting with a woman. But physically, that just didn't make much sense. Rick was a big guy. He was at least 6 feet tall and at least 200 pounds, and so Standifer had a hard time imagining a typical woman alone being able to overpower him. Even a strong man might have had trouble dealing with Rick, given Rick's size. So now, as Standifer stood there looking at the hair and the blue clip, he started to wonder if, maybe there wasn't just one killer here. Maybe there were multiple killers, and that's how Rick had been overpowered. Standifer went to go find Detective Kelly. Whether it was one killer or multiple, it was clear the level of brutality at this crime scene suggested there had to have been a personal motive. And so the detectives needed to start making a list of everyone the Wamsleys were close to. It was almost 8 a.m. the following morning by the time Standifer was done at the scene. When he left the house, he saw that beyond the yellow crime scene tape, there was a crowd of neighbors and news trucks gathered to see what was going on at the Wamsleys. As Standifer walked to his patrol car, a deputy approached him and told him they'd been talking to some of these neighbors and they had some information. One person said they heard multiple gunshots around 3 a.m. yesterday morning, which was 21 hours before the 911 call came in. And another said that last night around 9 p.m., they noticed the Wamsleys had not turned on their Christmas lights, which was unusual for them. Standifer ran through this timeline in his head. If it was true that there were gunshots at 3 a.m. on December 11th, and then by 9 p.m. later that same day, the house was uncharacteristically dark and the Christmas lights were not on, well, the reason for that could be because by that time, the Wamsleys were already dead. The 911 call had come about 2.5 hours after that neighbor had noticed the Christmas lights were not on in the house. But somebody was in that house who made the 911 call, and based on this timeline, it seemed it could not have been Rick or Susie because they were dead by the time the 911 call happened. So who was in the house making that call? Standifer asked the deputies if there was anything else, and they said, yeah, there was. The neighbors had also told them that the Wamsleys had 2 adult children, Sarah and Andrew. Sarah lived in her own apartment, and the deputies had already contacted her. She was on her way to the station. But Andrew still lived with his parents, and the deputies, so far, had not been able to reach him. At this, Standifer felt himself immediately tense up. Both the Wamsleys' children needed to be looked at as suspects. It was highly likely that with the parents both dead, the kids would inherit money, and probably a lot of it, judging from the very upscale neighborhood where their parents lived. And the fact that Andrew lived with his parents, but wasn't at home and was currently unreachable, made him the much more suspicious of the 2 siblings. But just then, Standifer heard somebody yelling. He looked up to see a dark-haired young man getting out of the driver's side of a Ford Mustang. He was gesturing wildly to a police officer who had stopped the car, pointing to the home, the crime scene, and saying that that was his house. A young woman got out of the passenger side of the vehicle, and Standifer could see she and this young man both looked totally panicked. The detective hustled over to the car and asked the young man what his name was, although he was already pretty sure he knew. It was, in fact, Andrew Wamsley. Andrew told them that he and his girlfriend, the woman he was with, had seen a news report about 2 bodies in this neighborhood being found, and he had driven here to make sure it was not his mother and father. As he said this, Standifer's eyes immediately went to the girlfriend's hair, hoping it was dark brown, like the hair he had found inside of Rick's fist. But it was blonde. Standifer was momentarily disappointed, but he knew that the girlfriend's hair color didn't actually prove or disprove anything about Andrew himself. And so Standifer looked around at the news cameras and the crowd and decided he would wait to give Andrew any details about what had happened. And so he just told the young couple to come with him back to the station where he would explain everything. A short time later, Standifer sat across the table from Andrew inside of an interview room, watching the young man fall apart as he learned his parents were both dead. Andrew looked down at the ground as Standifer broke the news, unable to speak as tears streamed down his cheeks. Standifer waited for Andrew to calm down a little bit, but he didn't really calm down at all, and so Standifer just began asking basic questions, because it seemed like Andrew was not going to be capable of giving anything more than short, simple answers. He said that he lived with his parents, but stayed at his girlfriend, Chelsea's, most of the time. And during the period of time that police believed the couple was murdered, Andrew said that he and Chelsea played some miniature golf, they went to the movies, and then they went to a friend's house for most of the night before heading back to Chelsea's to sleep. After that, Andrew went quiet again, staring hard at the floor as his eyes welled up with more tears. To Standifer, Andrew's emotional reaction to this news seemed pretty sincere, and when Standifer looked over Andrew's hands and forearms, looking for any of the telltale cuts or bruises the killer almost certainly would have picked up while fighting with Rick, he only saw one small, shallow scratch on his hand, which realistically, Andrew could have gotten anywhere. But his emotional reaction and the lack of cuts and bruises on his body was not enough to rule Andrew out, especially if he was potentially working with somebody else. And so Standifer decided to push him a little bit, just to see how he reacted. He told Andrew that he was going to send some officers to check his car for blood, and he was also going to get Andrew's fingerprints. Then he also said he was going to have to confirm his alibi with his girlfriend and friends, and he was going to check his bank records, looking specifically for large payments that could suggest a paid hit. After that, Standifer just stood there, waiting for Andrew to get defensive or angry. But Andrew just nodded and said that all sounded fine. And so when Standifer stepped out of the interview room, he was not feeling too optimistic about Andrew as a suspect. And so when his partner, Detective Kelly, came around the corner and said Andrew's sister, Sarah, was in an interview room ready to be spoken to, Standifer was glad to hear it. The first thing Standifer noticed when he went into Sarah's interrogation room was that Sarah had long, dark hair, which was roughly the same color as the strands he had seen in Rick's hand. Now, he didn't let his excitement show. Instead, he just sat down at the table and simply asked Sarah what she had been doing on December 10th. Like her brother, Sarah was visibly devastated. But unlike Andrew, who had been barely able to talk, Sarah seemed almost like she was impatient with Standifer's questions. She rattled off her actions on the night of her parents' murder so quickly that Standifer could barely keep up with her. She said that she had gone to her parents' house around 6 p.m., and they had all gone out to dinner. They had all briefly come back to the parents' house after, and then Sarah took her daughter and went home for the night. And Sarah seemed like she might just keep on rambling, but Standifer stopped her and just said, "Look, do you know of anyone who might have wanted to hurt your parents?" And at this, Sarah's eyes widened, and she nodded furiously, like she had been waiting for this question. She leaned forward and blurted out that this was exactly what she wanted to tell him. Because 1 month ago, according to Sarah, somebody had tried to kill her and her parents. She said it happened in November. They had been driving on the highway when out of nowhere, they heard this loud banging sound. Worried it could be something to do with the car, they pulled over into a parking lot to see what had happened. That's when they found a distinct bullet hole in the rear of their car, near their gas tank. Sarah said they had reported this to police, but despite looking into it, the police never found a suspect. However, Sarah told Standifer that she always suspected her ex-husband, Todd Cleveland, was the shooter. She told the detective that she and Todd were in a custody battle over their daughter, which her parents were paying for. Todd was furious about it. Standifer sat back in his seat, trying to keep his face neutral, but he felt like a bomb had just been dropped in the middle of his case. The Wamsleys had been shot at twice over a 30-day period. Whoever had killed them was brazen and determined. The detective leaned back and folded his arms as he tried to work out what all this meant to him. On one hand, Sarah had been in the car during that first shooting, which made it very unlikely, but not impossible, that she was involved in that attempt. But she also had no real alibi for the night of her parents' murder, and had admitted she was in desperate need of money. She was also eager to talk, maybe too eager, and she had pointed the finger right at her ex, which could mean she was trying to distract Standifer from looking at her. Or it could mean she was scared, and that Todd Cleveland was the shooter, and he was guilty. Luckily, though, Standifer didn't have to make any decisions about her guilt or innocence on her demeanor alone. He had those strands of hair from the crime scene. So he told Sarah they would need a DNA sample from her. And Standifer had half expected her to protest, but instead, she agreed immediately. As Standifer left to get one of the evidence techs, he felt more confused than ever. Sarah had seemed like a promising suspect, but her willingness to provide DNA told Standifer she likely did not have much to hide. Standifer suddenly felt the weight of how tired he was. He'd been awake all night, and his exhaustion was making it hard to unravel this case that seemed to get murkier with every clue. The next day was December 13th. It had been 2 days since Rick and Susie Wamsley's bodies had been found, and detectives Ralph Standifer and Mark Kelly were standing around a desk at the Mansfield, Texas Police Precinct. They were going over photos, financial documents, witness statements, and the newly released autopsy results, which just confirmed a lot of what they already knew, that both Rick and Susie had been shot and stabbed, and that Rick had fought back very hard. Standifer was more sure than ever that this was a personal crime, so he and Kelly were going over all of the evidence they had on their two key suspects, the children, Sarah and Andrew Wamsley. In the last couple of days, they had learned a lot more about the Wamsleys and their children. Standifer had been right. The parents had a big estate that their kids were set to inherit. It was worth over $1.5 million. And Rick also had a large life insurance policy as well. And so this gave the siblings a very strong financial motivation for killing their parents. But all Standifer could come up with to this point was evidence that actually ruled both the kids out. They had taken Sarah Wamsley's DNA when they interviewed her, and it was not a match for the hair found at the scene, which didn't mean she wasn't somehow involved, but it meant the only real evidence Standifer had against her was her financial motive and a lack of an alibi. As for Andrew, his alibi checked out. His girlfriend, Chelsea Richardson, confirmed his story. The detectives had also contacted one of his friends, a guy named Jeremy Lavender, and he confirmed that Andrew and Chelsea were with him the night Andrew's parents were killed. Plus, Andrew's fingerprints didn't match the bloody ones that were found at the crime scene. There had also been a preliminary search of Andrew's car, and they hadn't seen any obvious blood yet, although the evidence texts were not quite finished. So, Standifer and Kelly were at the point in this case where they needed to seriously consider other suspects. And luckily, they already had somebody at the top of their list. Sarah had been sure that her ex-husband Todd was responsible for the attack on the Wamsleys that happened a month ago. Standifer had already reached out to the police of the town where the Wamsleys were shot at, and luckily, the officers there had extracted the bullet from their car door. And after testing that bullet, it showed that bullet came from the same gun that was later used to kill the Wamsleys. So, if Todd was a suspect for that attack, well, then by almost default, he had to be a suspect for the murders. So, Standifer grabbed his keys off his desk and flagged Kelly to come with him. It was time to go see Todd Cleveland. When the detectives sat down with Todd at his home, he seemed extremely agitated and sort of rattled. He said he had just heard about the murders, and he was totally stunned. He also said he knew this looked bad for him, but he was adamant he was not involved. He may have been at war with Sarah and Susie, but he liked Rick, and besides, he wasn't around the night of the 10th because he was working. He was a plumber, and he said he had a few emergency jobs that night and in the early morning too. Standifer and Kelly stayed for a bit longer, but they didn't get much more out of Todd. So eventually they left and headed back to the station, and right away they called Todd's plumbing clients to confirm his alibi. And sure enough, it all checked out. Once again, the detectives were back to square one. The following day, Standifer and Kelly drove out to the home of Andrew's girlfriend, Chelsea. They weren't there because they thought Chelsea was a suspect. Her blonde hair had pretty much ruled her out. But the detectives had decided that since they were already starting over, they may as well begin by reevaluating their first two suspects, the Wamsley's children, Andrew and Sarah. Neither sibling appeared to have been at the crime scene, but Standifer and Kelly wanted to learn more about who they were close to. Specifically, who in their lives they might have trusted enough to help them plan or even carry out a murder. When the detectives arrived at Chelsea's mother's house, where Chelsea lived, they knocked on the door, and Chelsea opened it up. And quickly, she invited the detectives inside. And as soon as they stepped in, Standifer just froze, because the house was truly a mess. Not just in disarray, but disgusting. There was trash everywhere and grime on everything. I mean, it really looked deeply dirty and uncared for. The two detectives just looked at each other and raised their eyebrows. Over on the couch was another young woman who looked to be about Chelsea's age. When she saw the detectives, she stood up, walked over, and introduced herself as Chelsea's friend, Susanna. and over the course of their brief conversation, she told them that she had actually been staying in this house with Chelsea for quite a while. After that, Standifer asked Susanna to please give them some privacy, and she nodded and disappeared into a bedroom. At this point, Standifer sat down with Chelsea and began asking her a couple questions about the days around the murders, while his partner, Kelly, began to pace around the house. Chelsea had already confirmed Andrew's alibi once, but she seemed perfectly willing to go through it again, and nothing about her story changed. And Standifer was just wrapping things up when he heard Kelly gasp in the next room. When Kelly reappeared in the living room, he looked visibly shaken, but he said he was fine. The detectives left shortly after that, and when they got back in the car, Kelly explained why he had reacted like that in the other room. He said he had been looking through all the kitchen drawers because there had been a knife blade at the murder scene, and he wanted to see if its matching handle that was missing was in Chelsea's kitchen. But at some point when he opened up a drawer, a whole bunch of roaches crawled out. That's why he gasped. Standifer grimaced. But also, the thought of those roaches made something else click into place that had been bothering him the whole time they were at Chelsea's. He was thinking it seemed very likely somebody living in a place like that, living truly in squalor, might be eager for some money. And so as they drove back to the station, Standifer decided he needed to widen the range of people he was asking for DNA from. It clearly was not enough to get DNA just from Andrew and Sarah. That really had gone nowhere. What they needed to do was also get DNA samples from all of their friends as well. It would take almost a month to collect all the DNA samples they requested, and then the detectives had to wait another 2 months just to get the results back, which arrived on March 30th. And when the results did arrive, Standifer just sat at his desk, staring at the results in shock. Because now he realized that a major piece of the puzzle had been right in front of him the entire time. Based on these DNA results, the investigation, and also a confession, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Rick and Susie Wamsley in the early morning hours of December 11th, 2003. Just before 3 a.m. on December 11th, the killer stood outside of 820 Turnberry Drive, watching Rick and Susie's garage door slowly rise. As they waited for it to open all the way, they felt both dread and also a sense of nervous anticipation. They had been talking about killing Susie and Rick for months, and actually, they had already tried to do it once before. But now, if everything went according to plan, it was actually going to happen. Once the door was fully open, the killer slipped inside, and as they entered, they could hear the sound of footsteps right behind them, their 2 accomplices. All 3 very quietly began to creep through the home, and as they passed through the kitchen, 2 of them grabbed knives. They already had a gun with them, but they figured it didn't hurt to be as prepared as possible. The house was completely silent. It was obvious both Rick and Susie were asleep. The killer was eager to get started, because in their mind, Rick and Susie had more money and a better life than they deserved, and it just was not fair. The killer had nothing, and so killing Rick and Susie would not only feel good, but it would be the answer to all of their problems. On the other side of what they did this night was going to be a much better life. And so with the gun in hand, the killer walked down the hallway to the living room where they found Susie, asleep on the couch under a blanket. And the killer, as soon as they were standing over her, raised their gun, aimed it at Susie's head, and fired a shot. And immediately, the killer then hurried upstairs to the bedroom where Rick was, and they shot at him too. Except this time, their aim was off. Their bullets hit the doorway outside the bedroom, and as Rick jolted up, the killer fired again. This shot hit Rick in the temple, but Rick didn't fall. Instead, to the killer's horror, he ran at the killer and began to fight them. The killer struggled with Rick, and before they knew it, they both were in the living room where Rick managed to force the killer to drop the gun. At this point, one of the 2 accomplices tried to get Rick off the killer, but while Rick was being pulled away, he managed to grab the killer's hair and ripped some of their hair out of their head, along with their hair clip. When Rick then tried to turn and run for the front door, the other accomplice grabbed the gun from the ground and shot Rick in the back, which caused him to finally collapse. But he still wasn't dead, and he looked up at the killer and the accomplices to ask why they were doing this. But the 3 of them just stared at Rick in shock. They hadn't realized how hard it was going to be to kill someone, And so now they were actually wondering if just shooting Susie once was actually enough to kill her. And so instead of talking to Rick, the killer and one of the accomplices began simultaneously stabbing Rick and Susie over and over again until they both were for sure dead. The trio then fled the home, and the primary killer spent the rest of the night totally excited about the good fortune that would almost certainly befall them once the bodies were discovered. But after that whole day passed, the next 20 or so hours passed, there still had been no indication that anybody knew Rick and Susie were dead. And this was a problem for the killer and their accomplices, because the sooner the bodies were found, the sooner they would get access to the money that they had killed for. So, just before midnight, they returned to the crime scene, picked up the landline phone, and dialed 911. Then, without saying anything, they placed the phone receiver on the counter and fled the house for a second time. When Detective Standifer got the DNA test results back from the hair that had been found at the crime scene, it told him exactly who had attacked Rick. But the hair didn't actually match any of his suspects. It belonged to someone that they actually hadn't even interviewed. The hair was a match for Susanna Toldano, the same Susanna who was a friend of Andrew's girlfriend, Chelsea, who was present at her house the day they went to go re-interview her. It would turn out Susanna was the one who had fired at Rick and Susie's car back in November. And on the night of the actual murders, it was Susanna who shot Susie and fought Rick. She was the primary killer. Susanna did this because she needed money, and she had actually been promised a large chunk of it by her accomplices, Andrew and Chelsea. It was Andrew and Chelsea's idea to murder Susie and Rick. Andrew was furious with his parents because they had cut him off financially after they found out he'd secretly dropped out of college. He was also in love with Chelsea, who didn't have a lot of money, and she lived with a single mother who had to work multiple jobs to barely keep their family afloat. And so the plan was made to murder the parents for money. But it was ultimately Susanna who pulled the trigger. Susanna, Chelsea, and Andrew were all convicted of murder, and they were all sentenced to life in prison. As for Sarah, she had nothing to do with the murders, and she has never healed from the loss of her parents. But late on a June evening in 2000, a detective with the Easton, Pennsylvania Police Department sat in his car on a darkened neighborhood street, watching a house right nearby and waiting patiently. After what seemed like an eternity, finally somebody emerged from this house, and in their hands were a couple of bulky trash bags. The detective tensed up, but they didn't move. The detective kept watching as this person placed the trash bags on the curb for pickup in the morning, and then this person went back inside the house. And right then is when the detective flung open his car door, and as quickly as he could, he darted across the street towards the house, but instead of going in to confront this person, he just grabbed their trash bags at the curb. Then, with these bags, he ran back to his car, stuffed the bags in his trunk, and he drove away. And as he drove away, he knew he was about to solve his murder case. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the follow button's home and superglue. On May 28, 2000, an 18-year-old woman named Devin Guzman stood on a beach on the island of St. Croix in the Virgin Islands. She squinted her eyes from the sunlight as a tropical breeze blew lightly through her shoulder-length hair. Standing facing her was her girlfriend, Michelle Hetzel, who was also 18 and who was holding a pair of gold and diamond rings in her hand. Devin almost began to tear up as Michelle slipped one of the rings onto her ring finger, and then Devin reached out and did the same, placing the other ring on Michelle's ring finger. Then the young women held hands and recited vows to each other. Now, there was no priest or marriage officiant present, but for Devin, it didn't matter. She was spiritually and emotionally pledging to spend the rest of her life with Michelle. And in this moment, she couldn't imagine she could ever be happier. Their private little makeshift wedding ceremony during their Memorial Day weekend vacation almost felt like a fantasy. St. Croix was hundreds of miles away from Northampton County in Pennsylvania, where Michelle and Devin both lived. Michelle lived in a city called Easton, and Devin lived nearby in Forks Township. But life had been full of exciting changes recently for Devin. In the last 4 months, she'd moved out of her mom's house, gotten her own car, and started a full-time job as a cleaning technician for a company that repaired and restored property damage. And now, getting married to the woman she loved on a beach in the Caribbean felt like a romantic and fitting way to end a whirlwind couple of months. Now, Devin took Michelle's hand, and the two walked through the warm sand to a tourist trap bar to celebrate with some cold drinks. However, after they got a table and the afterglow of exchanging vows began to fade along with the late afternoon sun, reality began to set in for Devin. Getting married to Michelle in a tropical paradise was one thing, but dealing with the repercussions back home from this marriage was going to be something else entirely. It wasn't homophobia that she was worried about. In 2000, there was still some social stigma associated with being a member of the LGBTQ community, but Devin was confident and outspoken, and so this didn't bother her. What Devin was worried about, though, was the very complicated romantic situation that was waiting for her back home. Because despite the fact that Devin had just gotten, spiritually married to Michelle here on this beach, she was actually already living with her other girlfriend, whose name was Carrie Renner. And that wasn't all. Her other girlfriend, Carrie, was actually also married to someone else, a man. Although Carrie and her husband had actually been separated since he had left for the army to go to basic training. But Devin's relationship with Carrie was a lot different than her relationship with her new spiritual wife, Michelle. Devin and Carrie fought a lot, and their fights often became physical. Sometimes the police would have to come to break them up. Devin looked down at the pager clipped to her waist, and she was actually a little surprised that Carrie had not been paging her nonstop. Devin was planning to break up with Carrie as soon as she got home, and she really was not looking forward to the fight that would almost certainly cause. But she decided that, for right now, she wasn't going to think about any of that. Instead, she looked up and clinked her glass against Michelle's, then took a sip of her cocktail. Later that night, Devin and Michelle were relaxing back in their hotel room. They were preparing to head back home the next day, and they were both sad and kind of stressed that their trip was almost over, because going back home wasn't only going to be complicated for Devin. Michelle also had a difficult set of relationships waiting for her back in Pennsylvania. Just like Devin, Michelle was also married to someone else, a man named Brandon Bloss. Michelle had actually used Brandon's credit card to pay for this St. Croix trip. But, also just like Devin, Michelle was planning on breaking up with Brandon right when they got back home. However, Devin and Michelle had come up with a plan to make their transition into their new life of spiritual marriage together easier. And now, sitting on the hotel bed together, Devin put this plan into action. She picked up the hotel phone and called her father, Rick Guzman, who lived near her in Pennsylvania. When her dad answered, Devin told him about how she and Michelle had just gotten, spiritually married, and that she was planning to break up with Carrie. And then she asked if she and Michelle could come move in with him for a bit. Rick immediately said yes, and Devin knew just from the sound of his voice that he was actually thrilled with her news, because he knew all too well that her relationship with Carrie was sort of a nightmare. So Devin thanked her dad and said she loved him very much and hung up. Then she and Michelle went to sleep feeling happy. A few weeks later, at around 6:30 p.m. on Thursday, June 14th, Devin and Michelle were hanging out and drinking at Devin's father's house in Pennsylvania, like they often did these days. However, Devin and Michelle were not actually living there yet, like they had planned to do way back in St. Croix. And this was because neither of them had actually broken up with their other partners yet, or had even told them about their spiritual wedding with each other. Basically, they had kept everybody in the dark. And as this night wore on, and Devin and Michelle drank more and more, this fact started to become a point of contention between them, and they started to bicker. Both of them were mad at the other for not fully committing. And so a little after 9 p.m., Devin and Michelle each left the house feeling really mad, and they got into their own cars and they drove off to their own homes. A few minutes later, Devin stumbled drunkenly up the stairs and towards the door of the apartment that she still shared with Carrie that was right above a bar in Forks Township. She paused before she walked in. She was dreading the confrontation she knew was waiting for her inside. Devin looked down at the palm of her hand, at a cut that had not quite finished healing yet. Only weeks earlier, after she had come home from St. Croix, she had tried to tell Carrie she did want to break up, But before she could say very much, Carrie had threatened to kill herself with a knife. And then when Devin had tried to wrestle that knife out of her hands, Devin had gotten this big cut on her hand, which required a trip to the emergency room. And so eventually, Devin took a deep breath, then reached down and turned the doorknob and walked inside. As expected, Carrie was waiting, and she was very upset. Devin couldn't hide the fact that clearly she had been out drinking, and also she couldn't hide who she had been out drinking with. And so naturally, they began to argue. And for the first time, Devin told Carrie that she and Michelle had exchanged wedding rings during their trip to St. Croix, and this made Carrie fly into a rage. And so she hit Devin, and Devin hit her right back. And then before it could turn into a full-blown physical altercation, Devin's pager suddenly went off. She picked it up and saw that Michelle had actually been paging her nonstop, she just hadn't noticed. And so quickly, she just walked away from Carrie and went into another room to call Michelle. And then a few minutes later, she just came back into the living room where Carrie was still standing there fuming. And Devin told Carrie that, hey, Michelle's not feeling well, and so I'm going to go over to her house and check on her. And Carrie was sort of caught off guard and just said, well, I'm going with you. And Devin, not wanting to argue anymore or have this escalate any further, told Carrie that fine, she could come as long as she stayed in the car the whole time. So at around 10:30 p.m., Devin pulled her car up to Michelle's house in Easton with Carrie sitting in the passenger seat. Devin reminded Carrie to remain where she was, and then Devin got out of the car and walked up to the front door. Devin knocked, and Michelle's husband, Brandon, answered. And unsurprisingly, he said he would not let Devin inside. However, the reason he gave was because his wife, Michelle, was upset that Devin had come here with Carrie. And so he told Devin that if you want to come inside, you first have to bring Carrie home. And so Devin just turned around, walked back to her car, got inside, and informed Carrie that she was going to have to drive her back home and that she really didn't want to fight about it. And surprisingly, Carrie just sort of agreed because she didn't want to fight either. And at around 11:30 p.m., Devin dropped her off back at the Forks Township apartment. Devin did go into the apartment with Carrie for a little while, but then at about 12:15 a.m., she went back outside and left to return to Michelle's place. About 30 minutes later, around 12:45 a.m. on that Friday morning, the phone at Devin and Carrie's apartment began to ring. Carrie answered and heard Michelle's voice on the other line. And Michelle sounded really upset. She was demanding to know where Devin was. Carrie told Michelle to slow down here. She said Devin wasn't home because she had gone to your place. And when Michelle heard that, her voice turned frantic. She told Carrie that Devin had not returned to her house that evening, and that she'd been paging Devin over and over again, but Devin still had not called her back. Now, to Carrie, this seemed like classic Devin behavior. Devin had a habit of storming off dramatically and disappearing for a while and not talking to anybody, but she always came back. And so Carrie tried to reassure Michelle that, Devin would turn up soon. However, trying to reassure Michelle only made Michelle mad. Michelle began accusing Carrie of lying and started insisting that Devin must be with Carrie right now, and that Carrie was selfishly keeping Devin from seeing her. Then, very abruptly, Carrie heard Michelle slam the receiver down to hang up the phone. Carrie thought that was going to be the end of it, but about an hour and a half later, at about 2:30 in the morning, there was a loud knock on her door. And when Carrie answered, she found herself face to face with Michelle. And just as Michelle had done over the phone, she once again began to aggressively accuse Carrie of literally hiding Devin in the apartment. But Carrie told Michelle she had nothing to hide. And to prove it, she let Michelle come in and look around for Devin. Carrie figured, once Michelle searched her apartment, she would chill out and realize Carrie was honestly telling the truth here, but Michelle did not chill out. Instead, after searching the apartment and not finding Devin, Michelle took out her phone and called 911. Hours later, still on that Friday morning, Carrie woke up in bed, where she'd finally collapsed after being awake most of the night. The cops had come to her place after Michelle called 911, but they seemed totally uninterested in the fact that Devin could be missing. And since it hadn't been 24 hours since she'd been seen or heard from, they really couldn't even file a missing persons report. Instead, the cops issued what's called an attempt to locate report, which as far as Carrie could tell was basically the same thing, but just way less urgent. And before Carrie could even begin to sort out all her thoughts, there was another knock on her door. And so Carrie got up and she opened it up, and once again there was Michelle. And she looked like she literally hadn't slept. And then she would say that, yep, she'd been up all night and all morning just calling Devon's pager over and over again and just not getting an answer. Carrie rubbed her eyes and told Michelle to please calm down, that she was just making herself crazy here. But Michelle ignored her and suggested they should both drive around together and see if they could literally just go find Devon, since it was obvious the cops were not going to be much help here. Carrie did not really want to go drive around with Michelle, but she figured, at the very least, it would get Michelle out of her apartment. So Carrie got dressed and got into Michelle's car, and the two of them drove around town, scouting all the usual places they would go to with Devon. But realistically, Carrie was barely paying attention. She thought the whole thing was a big waste of time and that Devon was sure to turn up soon on her own. That is, until around 1 p.m., when they arrived at a place called Canal Park, which was this gravel parking lot in Easton right next to a river. Because as they pulled into the lot, Carrie saw Devon's car, a silver Pontiac Sunfire with a rainbow sticker on the bumper. And so as soon as Michelle came to a stop, Carrie jumped out of the car and ran over to Devon's car and tried to open the door, but it was locked. She banged on the window in frustration and tried to look inside, but the windows were too tinted so she couldn't see anything. But then she remembered she actually had a spare key in her pocket. So she pulled it out, unlocked the door, opened it up, and when she did, she screamed. A half an hour later, Detective Barry Golozeski of the Easton Police Department stepped out of his cruiser at Canal Park. As he slipped under the yellow police tape that cordoned off the area, Golozeski mentally ran through what dispatch had told him. 2 women had discovered the body of their friend, another young woman named Devon Guzman. He looked over and saw 2 crying women in the park, and figured those must be the 2 women who found the body. Golozeski just shook his head. Easton was not the kind of place where you would expect to find a dead teenager in a parking lot. Nonetheless, he walked over to the car to get a look for himself, peering in through the open rear door. Devon's body was curled up on the back seat, facing the rear of the car and covered by a green jacket. He slipped on a pair of disposable gloves and went in for a closer look. He peeled back the jacket, and right away he saw a gaping wound on the front of Devon's neck. But he noticed right away that there was very little blood for such a major injury. And her clothes weren't covered in blood either, which is what he would have expected. Instead, he just saw dirt and grass stains. He scanned the interior of the car and saw that it too was pretty clean, although one of the floor mats was missing. But the strangest detail was what Devon had clenched in her hand. She was holding a kitchen knife. Something about this didn't sit right to Golozeski. The knife in Devon's hand seemed to suggest she might have cut her own throat, but slitting your throat was a horrible way to die. Besides, there was almost no blood, barely any in the car and none on the knife. So to Golozeski, he felt like this was not a suicide. This was a murder staged to look like a suicide. Just then, the coroner's car pulled into the gravel lot, signaling to the detective that it was time for him to get a move on. Golozeski grabbed a cop standing nearby and told him to have both Devon's car and the car her friends had been driving when they found her impounded immediately. Devon's car for obvious reasons, but the friend's car as well, because the women had driven it so close to the crime scene. Then Golozeski walked over to the 2 hysterical friends of his victim and told them he would give them a ride to the police station to get their statements. Around 3 p.m. that afternoon, Golozeski walked into an interview room at Easton Police Headquarters and sat down across from Carrie, who had been crying so much that her eyes were red and bloodshot and her voice was hoarse. Golozeski started with the basics, asking Carrie how long she'd been friends with Devon. Now, in a homicide investigation, Golozeski knew that everyone connected to the victim starts off as a suspect. But neither Carrie nor the other friend, Michelle, seemed particularly suspicious, at least to him so far. That was until Carrie started talking. Because right away, she explained to Golozeski that she and Devon were not just friends. They were actually in a relationship together. Although she admitted she was also technically married to somebody else too. And Carrie didn't stop there. She told Golozeski that Michelle, the other friend who had been there when they found the body, was also in a relationship with Devon, But, like Carrie, Michelle was also married to someone else, another man, and she was living with him. Goloszewski could barely keep this straight, but he also just couldn't believe what he was hearing. In the first 5 minutes of his interview, he already had a list of 4 people: Carrie, her husband, Michelle, and Michelle's husband, who were all romantically linked to the victim. The potential for jealous rivalries here was through the roof, and so they were definitely all suspects. And so they were all going to need an alibi. So Goloszewski told Carrie to slow down and asked her about the last time she had seen Devin. Carrie took a deep, calming breath. Then she said that she and Devin had been fighting recently because Carrie was really upset about Devin's ongoing relationship with Michelle. She said that Michelle and Devin had recently gone to St. Croix together, and it just really upset Carrie. Goloszewski nodded, but inside he was thinking this is sort of like textbook jealous rivalry here. However, Carrie went on to say that their most recent fight had not been as bad as some of their other fights. She admitted that on other occasions when they got into fights, that she and Devin would get physical. But most recently, she said their fight had just been them yelling at each other. And then, after this heated argument, Carrie said she had actually gone with Devin to Michelle's house, where Michelle's husband had told Devin to take Carrie back home again. And so Carrie said Devin came back to the car and did drive her back to the apartment, and she got dropped off at about 11:30 p.m., and then Devin left again a little while later to presumably go back to Michelle's. But apparently she hadn't made it there, because Michelle had called, asking Carrie, where is Devin? And she said, I thought she was with you. When Carrie finished, Goloszewski just sat there, trying to make sense of this very complicated story she had just told him. Of all the romantic partners in Devin's life, it seemed to Goloszewski that Carrie was, physically at least, the closest to her, given that they lived together. And so that put her pretty high up on the suspect list. But on the other hand, she was being extremely candid about the ugly side of their relationship, which made him think, she might not be trying to hide anything. After Goloszewski wrapped up the interview, he told Carrie she could go. Then Goloszewski walked out of the room, wondering what more his victim's other girlfriend could possibly have to say. But when Goloszewski sat down to speak with Michelle, Devin's other girlfriend, the other friend who found the body, he immediately sensed that this was going to be a very different kind of interview. Carrie had been almost shockingly honest, but Michelle seemed far less interested in talking much at all about her personal life. She downplayed her relationship with Devin, saying that while they had been romantically involved in high school, they were just friends now. So typically, a person lying about their romantic affiliation with a murder victim was a huge red flag for Goloszewski. But this case was a bit different. In the year 2000, being gay or bisexual was not as widely accepted as it is today. And so it was actually more surprising to Goloszewski that Carrie had been so open about it than it was that Michelle was sort of trying to downplay it. And so he didn't press Michelle too hard on her romantic relationship with Devin. And besides, Michelle seemed to have a lot to say about Carrie. Michelle told Goloszewski that when Devin did not return to her house after dropping off Carrie on the night she disappeared, Michelle called Carrie to find out where Devin was. But Carrie had sounded totally unconcerned. And then, when Michelle had literally gone to Carrie's house to look for Devin, she said the only reaction Carrie had about the whole situation was just irritation. Michelle said she had been the one to insist on calling 911, like we don't know where Devin is, we have to do something. But then when the police showed up, they didn't really take it seriously, which was upsetting, but what was even more upsetting was apparently Carrie's reaction to all this. Michelle told Goloszewski that Carrie basically didn't care and had even tried to talk Michelle out of calling the police in the first place, like she just didn't seem to care about Devin. After that, Michelle asked Goloszewski if Carrie had told him about the fight where Carrie had stabbed Devin in the hand. And Goloszewski just shook his head and said no. And so she told Goloszewski everything Devin had told her about that particular incident. And then at the end of telling the story, she told the detective that really that ordeal kind of summed up Devin and Carrie's relationship. And all of this did make Goloszewski more suspicious of Carrie, but then again, this whole four-way romantic relationship just generally seemed highly suspicious to Goloszewski. It was hard to try to sort out which of Devin's married girlfriends was lying about what and why. After wrapping up with Michelle, Goloszewski had just one more interview to conduct that afternoon, and that was actually speaking to Michelle's husband, Brandon Bloss. Some uniformed officers had gone to Michelle's house while Goloszewski was talking to Carrie and Michelle and brought Brandon in. And so after leaving Michelle, Goloszewski went to find Brandon. At this point, he didn't know what to expect. And for a second, when he entered the final interview room, he got excited. Because Brandon was sitting there sweating profusely and looking incredibly uncomfortable. And Goloszewski's first thought was that, boy, he must be nervous. But then, Goloszewski took in what Brandon was actually wearing, which was a long-sleeve shirt and jeans in the middle of summer inside of a tiny interview room with no windows and weak air conditioning. And so quickly, his excitement disappeared. Brandon was not nervous, he was just hot. The whole interview with Brandon turned out to be pretty unhelpful. He seemed to have no idea that his wife was romantically involved with Devin, and he also didn't know about their trip to St. Croix. In fact, he said that Michelle had told him that she'd gone on a business trip to San Francisco, not to a tropical island on vacation with Devin. Now, it was possible that Brandon could be pretending not to know anything about his wife's relationship with Devin, but given how tight-lipped Michelle herself had been with the detective, Goloszewski was inclined to think that Brandon might really be in the dark here. Eventually, Goloszewski told Brandon he could go home, and once he was gone, the detective just sat by himself in the interview room, thinking over his entire suspect list. He had already ruled out Carrie's estranged husband pretty much as soon as he had run his name through the system, because what he found is he was in the military and living 250 miles away on a base in New York. And Michelle's husband, Brandon, didn't seem very promising either, since he appeared to be basically clueless about his wife's romantic dynamic. However, Carrie and Michelle, on the other hand, seemed like real possibilities. So, Goloszewski wrote out 2 applications for search warrants, one for the apartment Carrie shared with Devin, and one for the home where Michelle lived with Brandon. Goloszewski was pretty sure Devin had not been killed where her body was found, and he figured with one of these searches, he'd find the real murder scene. So far, the investigation had been moving extremely fast, and to Goloszewski's delight, he was able to get both warrants granted right away, so the momentum continued. Late on the same night that Devin's body had been found, 2 teams of crime scene technicians descended on the 2 properties and began searching for evidence. Goloszewski went first to the home where Devin had lived with Carrie. And the first thing he noticed was the place was in shambles. Furniture was overturned and strewn about like a very intense fight had taken place there. In the bathroom, a few members of the forensics team had found what appeared to be a car's floor mat in the shower, just like the floor mat that was missing from Devin's car. And so the running theory became amongst the people on the scene that the mat was there because clearly it was being washed, and probably recently. And so Goloszewski watched as someone from forensics sprayed the shower floor beneath the mat with luminol, a chemical compound used by law enforcement to detect blood. And immediately, the area that was sprayed began to glow blue, suggesting that there was indeed the presence of blood either on that floor mat or in the shower. Now, the luminol test was not 100% accurate, but at this point, for Goloszewski, it was good enough. And so as he stood there looking at the glowing bathroom floor, he realized he might very well be standing in the home of his killer. By the time Goloszewski made it over to Michelle and Brandon's house to check on how the search was going over there, it was past midnight, so he was tired, but he was also feeling pretty good about the state of his case. And initially, when a crime scene tech began walking him through Michelle and Brandon's home, he felt even better, because there was no blood at all inside of Michelle and Brandon's house. There was no sign of a fight either. But then, the crime scene tech told Goloszewski that they had found some blood with the luminol test out in the backyard, on a pool cover and on the nozzle of a hose. Goloszewski frowned. Until this moment, he had felt lucky to have found blood in one suspect's home. Now he had blood in both the homes where all his suspects lived, making this thing even more confusing. Now, he was fairly certain that Carrie, Michelle, and Brandon had not all worked together to kill Devin, and even if they had, they wouldn't result in 2 separate murder scenes miles apart. Goloszewski checked his watch, and he saw that at this point, he'd been awake for almost 24 hours. And so he decided to let the crime scene unit finish processing both homes and go get some sleep. He'd come back fresh in the morning, and hopefully then, things would look clearer. When Goloszewski walked into his office the next day on June 16th, so one full day after Devin Guzman's body had been found, he found her autopsy report waiting for him on his desk, and it was gruesome. The wound to Devin's throat was a 4-inch-long cut that went almost all the way to her spine. The cut had severed her tongue and also sliced in half both her right carotid artery and also her right jugular vein. When the coroner originally pulled her body from the car, they thought for a moment that her head had actually been completely cut off. Devin had lost almost all the blood in her body before she was placed in the car. So Goloszewski had been right, that she had been killed somewhere else, like Carrie's shower or maybe Michelle's backyard. But as he continued reading, he realized he had been wrong about something else. The coroner had put Devin's time of death somewhere between midnight and 3 a.m. Until this moment, Goloszewski still thought that Carrie was his best suspect. But now he thought of something. Carrie didn't have a car. To kill Devin and leave her at Canal Park, Carrie would have had to walk 8 miles back to her apartment, which would have taken at least 3 hours. And so obviously she had not done that because she had been at home when Michelle showed up looking for Devin at 2:30 a.m. And so suddenly, Michelle was looking a lot better as Goloszewski's killer. And that's when Goloszewski's desk phone rang. An officer on the other line told the detective that he had the strange caller on hold, and that this guy was saying really weird stuff about the Devin Guzman case. The officer said he would patch him through. Goloszewski dropped the stack of papers on his desk and picked up a pen just in time to hear the voice of a man who introduced himself as George Vine Jr. The man said he was a friend of Devin and Michelle, and a few months ago, Michelle had offered him sex or money to, quote, get rid of Devin. Now, at the time, he said he just laughed it off because he knew how volatile Devin and Michelle's relationship could be, and he figured this was just more of that. But now that Devin was dead, he wasn't so sure. And now, neither was Goloszewski. And so Goloszewski now had a whole new theory for this case, with Michelle, not Carrie, at the center. But almost immediately, he started running into new problems. George Vine Jr.'s story sounded like a slam dunk, but when another detective went to take his statement, he found that it was actually months old and pretty vague, and that Vine had no corroborating evidence. And as Goloszewski and his team began the painstaking process of conducting interviews with every family member, friend, and neighbor of Devin's they could find, more cracks formed in the Michelle theory. 2 separate sets of interviews threw Goloszewski off. The first set was with Michelle and Brandon's neighbors. They told police that Michelle and Brandon fought with each other constantly, and that, contrary to what Brandon had told Goloszewski, he did know about Michelle and Devin's relationship, and he wasn't happy about it. And one of these 2 neighbors had actually heard Brandon arguing with Devin on the same night Devin was killed. And so this made Goloszewski think that he should be looking more closely at Brandon. However, the second set of interviews muddied the waters even further and pointed him right back at Carrie. Because her neighbors said that on the night of the murder, they heard fighting too. Now, Goloszewski already knew that Carrie and Devin had fought because Carrie herself had told him this, but Carrie had claimed that the last time she saw Devin was at about 12:15 a.m. when Devin left to head to Michelle's. Her neighbors, though, said differently. One woman said after hearing this fight, she had walked past their apartment at about 1:30 a.m., and she saw that the front door was open. And inside, she said that she could see this woman laying on a couch wearing a green jacket. This was obviously significant because when Devin's body was found, she was being covered by a green jacket. If what this woman said was true, it meant Carrie lied about when Devin left her apartment. The final complicating piece of evidence arrived late that afternoon. The crime scene techs had tested the blood found at both Carrie and Devin's apartment and Michelle and Brandon's apartment. The blood that was found in Michelle and Brandon's yard couldn't be matched to anyone because it was too diluted. But the blood in Carrie's shower was a match for Devin. Less than 1 week into his murder case, Goloszewski now had 3 suspects. They all had motive and opportunity, and they had all lied to him. And Goloszewski had witness statements and physical evidence that made all of them look guilty. But Goloszewski knew they didn't all murder Devin, and he was stumped as to how to figure out which one did. Devin's funeral was held on June 21st, 6 days after her murder. 400 people attended her funeral. And right around that day, Goloszewski and his team sat down with all their files and went back to square one. They went through every interview, every piece of physical evidence, every observation that any of them had made during their investigation so far, and as they did this, they ended up stumbling upon this sort of unusual plan that they believed would point them to their killer. On June 28th, about a week and a half after Devin Guzman was killed, Detective Goloszewski sat in an unmarked police car parked on the side of a street. It was a Wednesday, which was important, because Wednesday was trash day, and Goloszewski was waiting for one of his suspects to leave their home and bring their trash to the curb, because their trash was not just trash. In Goloszewski's eyes, it was evidence. And in the state of Pennsylvania, once someone puts their trash out on the curb for collection, the trash is no longer considered private, and so the cops don't need a search warrant to go sifting through it. This kind of curbside search is called a trash pull. So now, Goloszewski was betting on bags of trash to close this case. Eventually, his suspect emerged carrying their trash, they put it on the side of the road, and Goloszewski waited until they were back inside their home. Then he climbed out of his car, grabbed the trash, put it in his trunk, and drove to the police station. Once inside headquarters, Goloszewski brought the trash bags into an evidence room, ripped them open, and dumped their contents out on a table. And then he began the very dirty work of sorting through all the smelly junk, the rotting food, the discarded receipts, the coffee grinds, the wet paper towels, and balled-up clumps of newspaper. But then, right as he reached the end of the bag, he found something. This discovery would trigger the police to exhume Devin's body and look inside of her mouth. And once they did this, they had their killer. Based on evidence collected by the Easton Police Department over the course of a nearly 2-month investigation, this is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Devin Guzman in the early hours of June 15, 2000. Devin Guzman had actually left her killer's home, but she eventually came back. And when the killer saw her, all the rage they'd been feeling for weeks exploded, and the killer lunged at Devin. But Devin fought back, and for a brief moment, Devin escaped their killer and began to walk away, but the killer took the moment that Devin's back was turned to come up behind her with a knife, and they reached around and they viciously slit her throat. Then, after Devin had bled to death, the killer dragged Devin's body to Devin's own car. She put her body in the back seat, along with a decoy knife in her hand, and then the killer drove the car all the way to Canal Park and left it there. Now, the killer might have gotten away with it, except for the bite mark. They didn't even realize Devin had left during the fight. And the reason they didn't realize it is because Devin did not bite the killer. She bit the killer's accomplice. And the accomplice, not really realizing how significant that bite mark was, had just dressed the wound as if it was just any other wound. They'd put gauze and bandages over the bite mark. And unfortunately for them, but fortunately for law enforcement, those bandages, when they were discarded in their trash, well, police were able to actually see the bite mark on the bandage. It retained the bite mark and gave away that's what it had been dressed over. Now, Goloszewski might have noticed the bite mark on the accomplice's arm when he interviewed them, except the accomplice was wearing long sleeves in the middle of the summer. The killer was Michelle, and her accomplice was her husband, Brandon. The blood identified in Carrie's bathroom was indeed Devin's, but it had not come from her murder. She had simply bled in the shower, naturally, just close to the time that she was killed. The car mat turned out to not have any blood on it at all. Instead, it was stained with pickled beet juice, which Devin or Carrie had coincidentally tried to wash off in the shower. Devin's body was covered in dirt and grass stains because she was likely killed outside, in the backyard of Michelle and Brandon's home. As for the eyewitness who saw Devin on the couch at Carrie's house on the night of the murder, they were simply mistaken about the time. Both Michelle and Brandon were arrested in August of 2000. They each blamed the other for the actual killing, although prosecutors presented evidence that suggests Michelle had been wielding the knife. On October 5, 2001, both Michelle and Brandon were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. They later divorced. As for Carrie, she was completely exonerated and actually wound up reuniting with her estranged husband. Mysterious Stories is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Zeth Lundy. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision. On July 4th, 2018, a paramedic was hurrying through a hospital in England when a supervisor flagged him down looking very concerned. She asked him if he had been one of the paramedics on a very specific call a few days earlier. Surprised, the paramedic said yes. The call had been completely typical, so he didn't really understand why this particular call mattered so much. But the instant he confirmed he had been there, his supervisor said she would explain in a minute, but for right now, he had to take off all of his gear, like all of it, right now, because there was a chance that what he was wearing could kill him. So, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come. On the afternoon of June 29th, 2018, a 44-year-old woman named Dawn Sturgis sat on a blanket in a park in Salisbury, England, drinking some wine with a few friends and her boyfriend Charlie Rowley. It was Dawn's favorite way to spend a Friday, especially since it involved Charlie. So they'd been dating for 16 months, and she was completely in love with him, primarily because Charlie was truly like the lone bright spot in Dawn's otherwise really difficult life. So Dawn was an alcoholic who had struggled with an undiagnosed case of bipolar disorder for years. And so she had a hard time finding work. And for the last 2 years, she'd actually lived in a therapeutic group home. But it was a little after she had moved in there that she had very fortunately met Charlie. Now, on paper, Dawn and Charlie did not seem like they would be good for each other. Charlie was addicted to heroin. He also didn't have a job, and he was frequently in trouble with the law. And so when they first got together, people in Dawn's life worried that Charlie ultimately was just going to pull her down even further into her own problems. But they did make each other really happy, and so they spent basically all of their time together, going between each other's apartments and visiting the park and hanging out with their friends. And for Dawn, this taste of happiness had made her want to make some positive changes in her life. Now, she still drank alcohol, but she finally got her bipolar disorder diagnosed and properly medicated. And she was feeling stable for the first time in years. She was even planning to move out of that group home and into a new apartment soon, and hoped that, that would give her a chance for a true fresh start. And because of all these changes, Dawn had planned a get-together with her family to show them how well she was doing. It was in a few days, and she'd really wanted Charlie to come with her, since their relationship, at least in her mind, was a huge reason she'd been so motivated to turn this corner. Except, despite how much she adored Charlie and really was excited for her life with him, at the current moment as they sat in the park on this Friday, she actually was really mad at him. So before arriving at the park, Charlie and their friends had done some heroin and some other drugs, and being under the influence of these substances was making Charlie act like a total jerk. Dawn had just bought some new hair dye to give herself a new look for this get-together with her family. And now Charlie, high on drugs, was wasting it by putting it in his beard and his eyebrows as a joke. And so Dawn ultimately was really mad, not so much because he was wasting the dye, but because by dyeing your beard and eyebrows and all that Charlie was going to look like a total deranged mess when he met her family for the first time in a few days. And so when she expressed her concerns to Charlie, he did go and, wash out the dye from his face, and he got most of it out. But even after, Dawn still felt just so annoyed by the whole thing. It's like he knew how important this meeting with her family was going to be. Why would you jeopardize that? And so in the end, even after he had cleaned himself up, Dawn just got up and stormed off, leaving Charlie and the friends to pack everything up. She was done. Hours later, around 10 p.m. that night, Dawn lay on the couch in Charlie's living room, listening to Charlie and their friend Sam Hobson talk about life and how unpredictable and how unfair it could be. Now, Dawn was still feeling annoyed at Charlie, but overall, she was mostly back to being in a pretty good mood. After she had stormed away from the park, she had gone to her place, and she had dyed her hair with the rest of the dye that was left, and then she'd called her mom. Dawn actually had 3 kids of her own, and 2 of them were adults. But her own mother, so Dawn's mother, had custody of the youngest child, and Dawn was hoping that maybe they could all see each other tomorrow at this get-together. And her mother had said yes, so Dawn was really looking forward to that. But at this exact moment, all Dawn really wanted to do was just go to sleep. So she got up off the couch to go grab her nightly medication out of the bathroom, and just to get there, she had to carefully step around all the junk and just sort of random items that were laying strewn about all over Charlie's apartment. Charlie was always going out and finding things out on the street or even in dumpsters and bringing those things back home. Sometimes he would sell these things afterwards, but a lot of the things he just sort of kept around. So the apartment was very cluttered. But Dawn successfully navigated the pathway to the bathroom. She grabbed her pills and then went back to the couch, swallowed the medication, and then she lay back into the cushions. Then minutes later, she was asleep. The next morning, Dawn woke up on Charlie's couch a little bit before 9:30 a.m. She did have a small hangover, just a little headache, but by her standards, that was not so bad. She had not drank a ton the day before, so this was a good start to her day. Just a few minutes later, Charlie came into the room and he sat on the couch next to her and said good morning. And between Dawn not feeling that great physically and remembering how obnoxious Charlie had been yesterday with the hair dye, Dawn really didn't feel like talking to him right now. But before she could say as much, Charlie's eyes lit up and he said he'd almost forgotten. He actually had a present for her that he'd gotten a few days ago. And then Charlie, he jumped up and he disappeared into the kitchen, and then he came back with a box, which he said was for her. It was her gift. And this made Dawn forget all about her irritation with him. Dawn didn't get very many gifts. I mean, she had a lot of friends in her life who, wanted to give her gifts, but, they, much like her and Charlie, didn't have much money. And so gifts were not a common thing in her life. And so to be receiving this gift right now was really exciting. And so Dawn smiled widely and she opened up the box's lid, and inside was this clearly very expensive bottle of perfume. And she gasped when she saw it. It was brand new. She would never have been able to afford something like this, and she was shocked, frankly, that Charlie had managed to get it for her. Like, how could he have gotten this? Dawn gave Charlie a very excited hug, and she told him she absolutely loved it. And so she pulled it out and she sprayed some on her wrists and she rubbed them together and she thought it smelled so good. And then she handed the bottle to Charlie and told him to please put this somewhere safe. Then she stood up from the couch with a big smile on her face and she went to get her makeup to go get ready for the day. About 5 minutes later, Dawn was sitting back on the couch with her makeup bag now in her lap, and she was applying foundation to her face and telling Charlie about how she was thinking about putting more dye in her hair, maybe a blue streak this time. But as she finished her foundation and reached for her powder, she felt her headache suddenly intensify. She winced, hoping it would pass, but pretty soon she started feeling pretty lightheaded and realized she was sweating quite a bit. She stopped talking about her hair and told Charlie she was feeling really weird. Charlie seemed worried and asked if she wanted some pain relievers, but Dawn just shook her head. She'd already taken her meds that day and didn't want to take more pills because it could upset her stomach. Instead, she handed her makeup bag to Charlie and asked him to go put it back in the bedroom, and then she hurried to the bathroom to splash some water on her face. And by the time she got in there and actually began putting the water on her face, it was like her whole body felt like it was on fire. She was sweating so much, to the point where she felt like this water wasn't enough. And so she actually just climbed into the empty bathtub and just figured the cold tile of the tub would feel good against her hot skin. But as soon as she climbed in and laid down, she felt her breath start to catch in her chest. From the living room, Charlie heard Dawn in the bathroom, and he heard the sound of the water turning on and then off, and then the sound of Dawn rustling around in there. Now, he was somewhat worried about her, but he also knew she regularly had hangovers, and she clearly had one now, and so he figured, that's what this was. He also really wanted to leave right now and go meet up with his friend Sam to shoot up some more heroin, because that would take the edge off his headache and his nausea. However, before he could do that, he heard a weird sound coming out of the bathroom where Dawn was. At first, he wasn't even sure what it was, but then he realized it was a gurgling sound. And so at this point, he jumped to his feet and he hurried to the bathroom door, and as soon as he opened it, he gasped, because Dawn was laying there in the empty bathtub, fully clothed, and frothing at the mouth. Charlie had no idea what was happening, but he instinctively ran over to her, pulled her out of the tub, and he laid her on the floor, and he could tell that she was basically unconscious and she was limp. And in fact, when he listened closely to her mouth, he couldn't even tell if she was breathing. And so Charlie's thinking, this is not a hangover. This is something way more serious. So he ran and got a phone and he called the emergency line. And when the dispatcher picked up, Charlie frantically explained what was going on, that, Dawn, his girlfriend, had just collapsed in the bathtub out of nowhere. The operator got his address and said they would send a paramedic, but they also told Charlie he would have to do CPR on Dawn while he waited, and so they explained to him how to do that over the phone. Charlie was horrified, but he tried to take a deep breath and do what they said so he could help Dawn, so he kept the phone by his side while he straddled Dawn and gave her chest compressions. It would take an agonizing 19 minutes before a single paramedic finally arrived. And by that time, Dawn had begun to turn blue. Charlie paced around anxiously inside of his apartment while the paramedic took over chest compressions. Charlie could hear the paramedic calling for more help on his radio. And sure enough, a few minutes later, more paramedics streamed inside. And at first, this made Charlie feel hopeful, like more medical support meant that Dawn was going to be okay here. But then, from his spot out in the living room, he heard one of the paramedics say something about drugs, like this could be an overdose or something. Charlie heard that and he called out that Dawn didn't do drugs, but the paramedics did not seem to hear him. And a second later, their voices got more urgent. They were using a lot of medical terminology that Charlie didn't understand, but he did catch one thing. Dawn's heart had apparently stopped. Now, the paramedics were actually able to get her heart beating again, but it took them more than an hour to get her stable enough to move her from Charlie's apartment to the hospital. And Charlie, he just watched in panic and despair as they loaded his girlfriend on a stretcher, and then he followed them out of the apartment to stay with Dawn for as long as he could. And then before they put her into the ambulance, he leaned in and he told her he would meet her at the hospital. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens came on, Charlie's friend, Sam, appeared, looking very shocked by the commotion. They'd had plans to go to a church event that day that had free food, which Charlie had totally forgotten about. But Charlie told Sam everything that had happened and said he had to skip out on that event because he needed to go to the hospital as fast as he could to meet Dawn. But even as he was saying this out loud, he knew he really couldn't do that. Because if he went to the hospital right now, he had no idea how long he'd be there. And since he was addicted to heroin, he would start to get sick from withdrawal if he didn't get some drugs in his system first. And so Charlie felt trapped. He really didn't know what to do here, and he sort of felt like he was on the verge of breaking down. This was just so much. But then he remembered he had a methadone prescription at the local pharmacy. Methadone is a drug that's often given to people who are addicted to heroin, who are, trying to get clean, and this drug is used to help them with addiction and withdrawal symptoms. It sort of closely mimics what the body would feel if it shot up the drug, but without, the euphoria and the actual high sensation of using the drug. Now, Charlie had not actually filled his methadone prescription yet, mostly because he was not focused on getting clean. But as he's thinking about needing to be at the hospital all day and needing to be, coherent and being able to talk to doctors and nurses and Dawn, he thought, well, hey, I'll go fill my methadone prescription. I'll take that. It'll keep me, from getting sick, but I'll also be clear-minded so I can be in the hospital and help Dawn. So Charlie asked Sam if he would come with him on a different outing to go to the pharmacy to get his methadone. A couple of hours later, at around 3:30 p.m., Charlie got back to his apartment with Sam. It had been incredibly hot outside, and walking around for that long, they now were both dripping with sweat. After they had gone to the pharmacy, Charlie and Sam had actually gone by that church event, but not really to get food, but instead to literally go say a prayer for Dawn. Now, they were back at his place to pack up a bag both for himself and also for Dawn that they would bring to her at the hospital, and then Charlie didn't really know how long he would be there, but he now had his methadone and figured he'd be okay. But as Charlie was doing this, it was like he couldn't think straight. He had this really intense headache, and even though it had been hot outside, it was like he just couldn't stop sweating. And so Charlie was thinking to himself, maybe it's the methadone. He had never done it before, and maybe this is like a byproduct. Maybe these are symptoms from taking methadone. So he decided he would just take a shower, thinking that would kind of, clear out these symptoms and he'd be back to normal. But after the shower, he felt even worse. And when he looked in the mirror, he saw his pupils were now constricted to little pinpricks. But he still tried to press on here, and he went into his room to get dressed and to finish packing Dawn's bag. But as just a couple of minutes went by, he noticed his heart began to race. And as it raced, it got faster and faster, like he couldn't calm it down. Now, over the past couple of days, between the methadone and heroin, Charlie had basically used a lot of drugs. But he did drugs all the time, and he'd never felt this combination of symptoms before. And so Charlie, he leaves the bedroom and he goes into the living room and he just sits down on the couch feeling completely awful. And he has this thought come to him. He's thinking, okay, I don't think it's the drugs because I always do drugs and this is not it. I've never felt this way. And he looks over at Sam, his friend, and he has this weird thought that it's like, what if Sam poisoned me? What if that's what's going on here? What if I've been poisoned? And without really thinking through how or when this could have happened or why, Charlie began berating Sam, saying, "You poisoned me! Why did you do this to me?" And Sam was so caught off guard that he was like, "What are you talking about?" And he began backing away. And Charlie, he just jumped up off the couch and began to pursue Sam like he was going to attack him. But after only taking a couple of steps away from the couch, Charlie's mouth filled up with so much saliva that he stopped being able to speak clearly. All he could do was kind of gurgle and spit out this froth, and then his legs got so weak and wobbly that he had to lean against the wall just to keep from falling down. And then he felt his whole body begin to seize up, and then the last thing Charlie was aware of was his friend Sam grabbing a phone and calling for an ambulance. About an hour later, inside of the emergency room of the Salisbury District Hospital, the on-call doctor stood in Charlie Rowley's treatment room while a nurse at his bedside took his blood. The doctor had just finished examining Charlie, who was now unconscious. He'd clearly had a seizure, and now he had a fever. He had constricted pupils, and he had labored breathing. So clearly, to the doctor, Charlie's condition was very serious. But the doctor was sure he knew exactly what had caused it. Charlie had overdosed on drugs. And the doctor really felt strongly about this because Charlie's girlfriend, Dawn, had been treated that morning for the exact same thing. She'd been brought in after her heart stopped, and she'd had a lot of the same symptoms as Charlie. Now, they had stabilized her, but she'd been admitted to the intensive care unit and was still listed in critical condition. And so the doctor felt really confident in his diagnosis of both Dawn and Charlie because the symptoms fit. And the officer in charge of both cases had confirmed that Charlie, at least, was a known drug user, and the apartment where they'd both been found had been full of needles and other drug paraphernalia. Over the next 24 hours, neither Dawn nor Charlie got any better. In fact, they both got much worse. Their nervous systems began to completely break down, meaning that essential body functions like breathing were beginning to fail. Dawn was literally in a coma and being kept alive by a life support machine, and Charlie was also still unconscious, and his breathing had declined to the point where they had to put him on a ventilator. He'd also been moved to the intensive care unit, same as Dawn. And so at this point, Charlie and Dawn no longer looked like they had simply overdosed on drugs. It seemed like maybe they actually took a bad drug, like there was poison in the drugs they took perhaps, or something completely different. But none of the medical staff could figure out what was actually wrong. It was totally anomalous. By the afternoon of July 3rd, so 3 days after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized, one of the doctors in the intensive care unit where they were, his name was Stephen Jukes, he had officially taken over both of their cases. Dr. Jukes had seen the results from the initial toxicology screenings, and they showed that while Charlie did have a significant amount of heroin and other drugs in his system, Dawn did not. All her results showed was that she'd taken some prescription psychiatric medication, and so Dr. Jukes had sent more of their blood to another lab to test for a wider range of drugs, so he was waiting on those results. But admittedly, he was losing faith that the results he was going to get would give him his answer. Now, by this point, Dr. Jukes had ruled out some things that could have caused their symptoms. Like at one point, they believed that, maybe the two had been exposed to a gas leak in Charlie's apartment because some of the symptoms you get with the gas leak are similar to what they had. But the main reason this theory didn't really work out is, Dawn and Charlie had been in the apartment together that morning that Dawn was brought into the hospital, but only Dawn was affected. Charlie wasn't. And so presumably they were both being exposed at the same time to, if there was a gas leak. But then Charlie, he leaves the house for several hours, so he's out completely unexposed to whatever was in there. He comes back into the apartment, and then he feels sick. It didn't really add up. If he got sick from a gas leak in the apartment, it should have happened at the same time as Dawn. Also, the first responders, when they were in there working on Dawn, they didn't report smelling anything odd. Now, of course, some leaks like carbon monoxide, you wouldn't be able to smell that, but a typical gas leak, you would be able to smell. It smells like rotten eggs. Plus, you also have the fact that when Charlie got sick, Sam, his friend, was in the apartment as well, and he did not get sick. So, all told, the gas leak theory seemed to not be it. Dr. Jukes had also briefly wondered if maybe what had happened to Dawn and Charlie was connected to this strange toxin exposure case that had come through the hospital a couple of months earlier. However, the victims in that case were from out of the country, and Dawn and Charlie had not been out of England, so Dr. Jukes had ruled that out as well. But Dr. Jukes did have one theory he still thought was a good one. Maybe this was pesticide poisoning. It matched with their symptoms, and Dr. Jukes knew that sometimes street drugs can be contaminated with pesticides. So if Dawn and Charlie had both taken something that Dr. Jukes hadn't tested for yet, then they could have maybe been exposed that way. He had told the police about this theory, and so they'd issued a press release encouraging drug users to be extra cautious in case, there was this pesticide out there. But Dr. Jukes also knew that drugs were not the only way people could be exposed to pesticides. Simply eating, drinking, or breathing in contaminated food or water or air could be fatal. And this was extremely troubling to Dr. Jukes and to everybody else involved with the case. Because if Dawn and Charlie had been exposed to potentially deadly chemicals just by doing normal things in their home or neighborhood, that meant that basically everybody else in their neighborhood was also in danger of getting sick too. Now, until Dawn or Charlie woke up again, they were not going to be able to figure out, where they had been or what they had touched or ingested before they got sick. So Dr. Jukes felt like he needed to get that information from somewhere else, and fast. The next morning, July 4th, so 4 days after Dawn and Charlie got sick, Dr. Jukes pushed open a door to a room where Dawn's mother, her 3 sisters, and her son were all waiting. He'd heard they were all here visiting Dawn, and so he had one of the nurses send them to one of these hospital family rooms so he could speak to them. He was hoping that they might be able to shed some light on where Dawn had been and what she might have eaten or drank before she got sick. Now, Dawn's family was staring at him with anxious expressions on their faces. He barely got out his introduction before they started lobbing questions at him about what was going on and why the news was describing Dawn as some kind of drug addict. Dr. Jukes just held up his hand to slow them down, and once they were quiet, he explained that at first they had believed this was an overdose because she had all the symptoms for it. But now, based on how the symptoms had progressed, he knew overdose was very likely not the case here. Then he told them his theory about the pesticides and said he really needed their help with it. He asked them to tell him everything they could about Dawn, her habits, her health history, and the people she typically saw. Dawn's mother said she had spoken to Dawn on the phone the night before all this started, and she said Dawn seemed fine. She had even asked to see her young daughter the next day at the big family get-together they were planning. Aside from that, though, the family said that, Dawn struggled with alcoholism and her mental health, and she didn't always tell them everything. And so they just didn't know much about Dawn's daily life with Charlie or her friends in Salisbury, although they were pretty sure that she rarely ever went outside of the city. But what the family primarily wanted to communicate to Dr. Jukes was that Dawn was not just some nobody the way the news had portrayed her. She was a loving mother and sister and daughter and friend, and she was really trying to do better, and she was doing better. She didn't want much. She just wanted a place of her own and a little more stability in her life, and that's the path she was on. And so they begged him not to give up on her. Dr. Jukes promised he would not. But as he left the room, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. He was glad to know more about Dawn as a person. She seemed wonderful. But he had been hoping for some kind of breakthrough about what exactly had happened to her, and he hadn't gotten that. None of them had been able to give him any answer that could maybe even begin to explain what was going on. And so at this point, he really wasn't sure what else he could even do. But as Dr. Jukes headed back towards his office to try to figure out his next move, he saw a lab tech rushing towards him down the hallway. The tech was holding a piece of paper, and when he reached Dr. Jukes, he shoved the paper into his hands. The tech was out of breath, but told Dr. Jukes he had to read this right now. So Dr. Jukes, he looked at the paper, and he saw that it was the lab results for Dawn and Charlie. And when he scanned its contents, He could not believe what he was reading. The new blood test that he had ordered did not confirm the presence of pesticides or of any other street drugs, but they did show something else, something so unexpected and so dangerous that Dr. Jukes now knew for certain that Don and Charlie were not the only ones at risk here. Everyone was, like literally everyone in Charlie's apartment building, everyone in Don and Charlie's neighborhood, all the paramedics, all the doctors, all the nurses that had treated them, and all the patients in the hospital. Literally everybody. In fact, it was even possible that everyone in the whole city was now in danger. And it might already be too late. And so Dr. Jukes sprinted down the hall towards his office. He picked up the phone and he called the police. A few hours later, the deputy head of investigations for one of England's counter-terrorism units, Philip Murphy, stood on the street outside of Charlie's apartment building. His team had completely cordoned off the whole building and evacuated everybody who was inside. Dozens of officers and crime scene technicians were going in and out of the space wearing these big protective suits, and they were swabbing surfaces and collecting evidence. Because of those tests that Dr. Jukes had run, Murphy knew exactly what substance had sickened Don and Charlie, but he had no idea how they could have come in contact with it. And answering that question was now a matter of international security. Now, not only was Murphy's counterterrorism unit involved, but so were multiple other agencies, including the UK's Secret Service, which is known as MI5. MI5 would deal with the other countries outside of Europe that were now getting involved in this. In addition to Charlie's apartment, the counterterrorism unit had been deployed to the hospital and were making anyone who visited Don and Charlie now wear protective gear. They had contacted all the paramedics and all the officers who'd interacted with Don and Charlie and made them bag up their uniforms and equipment as biohazards. Some police officers were now sifting through literally thousands of hours of CCTV footage from all around the city from the past few weeks, looking for any signs of Don or Charlie. And others were contacting Don and Charlie's friends to try to get a sense of their recent movements. At least one friend had already taken officers on a tour of a park they'd all gone to the day before Don and Charlie got sick. Murphy actually had a team headed there right now to close it off and start taking more samples. He also had another team at Don's place doing the same thing. And so, as Murphy stood there watching the officers in suits go in and out of Charlie's apartment, he knew that really, as big as this was actually just the beginning. He was going to have to be patient, because even though the situation was clearly urgent, he also knew it could take a long time to figure out exactly what happened and why. And so at this point, all Murphy, or anybody else for that matter, could do here was just hope that, the authorities found some answers before more people got hurt. But just 4 days later, on July 8th, Don was taken off life support and died in the hospital. And of course, that was incredibly tragic, but specifically for Murphy, he was hoping to get a chance to speak to her. She was, a potential treasure trove of information about how this whole thing happened. And now, of course, he would never get that chance. On July 11th, so 11 days after Don and Charlie first got sick, with Don now deceased and Charlie alive but still unable to talk, the agencies working on the case had managed to eliminate almost every location that Don and Charlie had visited as the source of this toxic substance, except for one. And that was Charlie's apartment. And so Murphy sent the forensics team back to the apartment to search it all over again. That afternoon, a lead officer with the forensics team stood in the middle of Charlie's small apartment alongside some of his colleagues. This lead officer and his team were all dressed in these very heavy-duty protective suits, so they moved slowly around the cramped space as they took samples of surfaces and bagged potential evidence. All the stuff, all the clutter in the apartment made it really hard to get around. There were clothes on the floor and open bags of fabric and dirty dishes stacked in the sink and on the counters and overflowing trash cans. And in the bedroom, there was a bunch of makeup and some hair dye boxes scattered on the floor, along with needles and other drug paraphernalia. There was not a ton of furniture in the apartment, but it was all over the place because paramedics had pushed it around during their response. And other areas of the place were littered with medical debris, like rubber gloves and plastic wrappers. And there was also just some trash and just kind of like random objects, water bottles, plastic toys, piled up on the windowsills. It was almost like there was literally too much in the apartment to even effectively test it all. But as the lead officer walked around doing his best to, identify things to be tested, something on a counter caught his eye. it was an object that looked very different from anything else in the apartment. Now, to understand what happened to Dawn and Charlie, you have to go back in time to 3.5 months before they got sick, when an unrelated older man and a younger woman were found unresponsive on a park bench in Salisbury and brought to the Salisbury District Hospital, the same one that Dawn and Charlie would go to. Now, this older man and the young woman, when they came into the hospital, they were experiencing seizures and they couldn't stop vomiting. But after being treated at the hospital, they actually both fully recovered. And at first, the doctors there, including Dr. Jukes, thought this man and woman were just regular civilians who had gotten sick, maybe from an overdose. But soon, it became clear that both of those things were not true. Number one, they were not just regular civilians. The older man was a Russian spy who had defected to England, and the young woman was his daughter. And they had definitely not overdosed. They had been poisoned. An investigation discovered that the substance that had been used to poison them was this very rare and deadly chemical weapon created by Russia called Novichok, a kind of nerve agent. And so 3.5 months later, after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized and getting worse and worse, and then that lab tech rushed down the hallway to show Dr. Jukes their new lab results, it was Novichok, the deadly chemical that Dr. Jukes saw printed on the paper. That was in their system. Investigators in the spy poisoning case had never been able to figure out exactly how the poison had been administered to the spy and his daughter. But the item that Murphy's forensics team had found on the counter in Charlie's apartment, the one that kind of stood out and didn't really appear like it belonged in this space, was the item that ultimately solved that mystery. It would turn out Charlie actually found the source of the poison, unintentionally. It was that brand new bottle of perfume that he had given to Dawn on the morning they both got sick. Because Charlie hadn't actually bought this gift at a store, he couldn't have afforded it. Instead, he had found it in a dumpster during one of his many dumpster diving excursions. And that dumpster just so happened to be the exact same dumpster where a Russian agent had discarded the poison perfume after the attempted assassination. So when Dawn accepted Charlie's gift and sprayed it on her wrists in excitement, she had accidentally exposed herself and Charlie to the deadly nerve agent. Charlie would eventually recover from his exposure to Novichok. As for the 3 Russian agents that authorities suspect were involved in this thing, they went back to Russia and have never been prosecuted, and Russia has denied involvement in the poisoning. Dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Kroll, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.